And we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya from the Imperial County SELPA here in Imperial County, California, on the very southeastern tip of California. Those of you who have been in our sessions or have participated ongoingly in our series for improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Today we'll have a focus on Section 3. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you to the Imperial County Office of Education, our superintendent, Dr. Fennell, the California Department of Education, who again has worked tirelessly with experts in the field to ensure that the California Practitioner's Guide is disseminated and supported to again ensure that we all work together collaboratively to serve English learners and English learners with disabilities, as well as the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE, who again with CDE are our grant providers. Our SELPA content lead brings you this information statewide for you to use and reuse as you work again in multidisciplinary teams in your region in support of English learners and English learners with disabilities and improving outcomes for them in your region, in your schools. So as we begin today will be in a webinar format. So you will see that our panelists, so this morning you'll see Q&A and chat boxes. Lupita Olguin-Rubio is here with us today, as well as Vanessa Lopez, and you'll hear from them later this afternoon. And as we review all of the information, know that you can engage with us through both the chat and the Q&A. We ask that through the Q&A, you can enter any wonderings that you may have, any potential questions that you have, while in the chat box, you may want to add any reflections, any aha moments that you have, any resources that you would like to share. Because again, as we work together, special educators, general educators, EL specialists together in this realm of supporting English learners with disabilities, we learn from each other ongoingly as practitioners in the field. So again, we encourage you to use both the chat box and the Q&A as you wish. We do want to ensure that you're able to also plan your day, because we do have a full day planned out for all of our participants with resources for you to engage with independently. But we want to ensure that you know when breaks are coming. I know in your crazy work, as you're potentially at a school site or at a different location, you may want to plan for your breaks. So we will ensure that we take a break every hour on the hour to ensure, again, that we give you some opportunities to take care and stay well during today's session. Again, we'll have our lunch at 11:30, and then you'll see their break every hour on the hour. Again, I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya from the Imperial County SELPA, leading this work as we, the SELPA content lead for improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. We work as a team in conjunction with each other, leveraging our own expertise and support for students and for yourselves as practitioners. My background is having been a school psychologist many years ago, followed by being a school site special education director, followed by a director at the county office for programs for students with moderate to severe disabilities before my role as a SELPA. So now 21 years later, I am having this opportunity to engage with all of you in support of students with disabilities and English learners as we understand our passion and want to have, again, this level of advocacy for our students as they make progress and growth towards, again, English language proficiency. And for that reason, I have a wonderful team. Lupita Olguin-Rubio, you'll hear from her a little bit later. And again, 20 plus experience as a curriculum coordinator and EL specialist herself, coming from the general education side of the house, as we want to model and share with you how, again, we together as a team engage in this work, as together we need support. Vanessa Lopez, who you'll hear from her later in today's session as well, 20 plus years as a special educator for students with disabilities and English learners, having been an EL coach, a coach of other special educators and general educators. Again, we come together to bring this information. So we'll share with you, again, our experiences from our own expertise in the field in serving English learners with disabilities. But as we come together, we hope that in your region, that you too emulate our work here, that you engage. If you're a special educator, that you have that relationship with general education, with your EL specialist, as this work is a together kind of work. It is a collective commitment to ensure that together we leverage and hone our expertise. So we hope that, again, we have a mix of participants during our session. So we invite you in the Q&A to share who's here, or in the chat, who's here? What region are you from? Are you here as a team? Perhaps you're in your location together as a team, or you've coordinated efforts to engage as special educators and general educators today. Perhaps you're an administrator, a teacher, speech pathologist, school psychologist. We'd love to hear. Share with us in the chat. We ourselves are in the Imperial County, and you'll see our logo there at the very southeastern tip of California, where we provide support directly to our particular region. But in this work, we're able to reach statewide to provide support. Should you be a region, district, COE, SELPA, who want to collectively work together to further and deepen the work, as our work in these series of sessions are an overview of the California Practitioner's Guide, you may find the need to engage in deeper work and want to have deeper discussions where we can come to you virtually, hopefully in person later as things get better in our communities, where we're able to assist you with tailor-made series of sessions. You can always visit our website and get an idea of where we've been already, but of course we would be more than happy to engage with you as we work within the system of support. As you may have already noted challenges, or like us, you have a passion for this work and you're being proactive by joining our sessions and want to further and deepen outcomes for English learners and English learners with disabilities. So as we work together in the system of support, a bit of more information if you want a general overview of the supports that we provide throughout California. This is a one-page document, if you will. You can click on it. It does have links to our website and further resources than we'll share with you today. But again, should this be a passion project that you want to engage with, we'd be more than happy to connect with you. So as we consider now, whom are the students that we are focusing in on today? The students that we want to leverage and highlight, bring to the forefront of our mind as we think of English learners and English learners with disabilities. So as we consider the needs of English learners, students who have a language other than English in the home, students who receptively and expressively have another language as their primary language, another language other than English, where they have language. And I want to preface that first, because as we consider the needs of English learners, we first need to acknowledge that our students do have language and skill. As we assist them with developing English language proficiency, we also recognize that our English learners are a varied population of students with different backgrounds, different needs, different profiles, and individual students that we want to ensure that we retain their individuality, their culture, their norms, and in support of them as they build our school community. As we consider students with disabilities, we're acknowledging that students with disabilities are students who have been assessed comprehensively with reliability and validity. Perhaps you attended our session, our last session, which was regarding assessments in section 2. And as we consider students who are truly eligible for special education, we acknowledge that there is a difference between language difference versus language disability. So as we look at the needs of our students, when we say student with a disability, that is a student who in fact meets the eligibility, one of the 13 eligibility categories from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for which now the student needs an IEP. So that is the start of our discussion today. We will focus on the IEP development today, and then in the next segment this afternoon, we will then further instructional practices and educational programming for English learners with disabilities. I do want to share that as we highlight the resources and the document from which we again want to build our common language amongst the field is a California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. We again will share with you our own anecdotal information, our own expertise and information, and of course the statutes, the mandates, federal and state, to ensure that we retain compliance. Always refer back to your EL master plan when necessary, your school district board policies, and we also from time to time ask you to reflect on your practices. both written and unwritten practices, because we also acknowledge that there are times when our practices may have deviated from what our actual policy is, or perhaps from the best practice or the state mandate. And this is our opportunity again to hone our craft, to give ourselves reassurance where we know we've engaged in successful best practices, and to also shift where necessary, where we need to refine practice. So throughout today's session, we do have a Padlet of resources. We will share various resources with you throughout the session. You have all of them in a full Padlet with all of the documents that you need. And in addition, these documents know that you can remake them, reshare them, rebrand them as you see appropriate. The Padlet can be remade and you can save it, bookmark it as you see appropriate. So again, thank you for participating. And again, we hope that it is engaging for you and you have all the resources that you need. So we'll jump right into California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, Chapter 5. Chapter 5 and its focus will be on educational programs and instructional strategies. And that all begins with the IEP. In Section 2, we reviewed assessment, pre-referral, and referral. We discussed that initial IEP process in which students are assessed comprehensively. As the IEP team has determined that an English learner does in fact has a disability, in those instances, and we move towards comprehensive development of the IEP. That's where we'll go next, followed by exceptional educational programs and what are appropriate, culturally and linguistically appropriate pedagogy with cultural relevance and support. That's where we hope to end today's segment. So as we start in Chapter 5 with the IEP development, we'll think about some questions. So if you're a teacher practitioner, service provider, or if you're an administrator, sometimes we have different questions that we're asking as we lead into. The questions as posed here in the Practitioner's Guide are in relation to effective IEPs. When we say effective IEPs and meaningful IEPs, we want to ensure that they are student-centered, student-oriented, for the individual as we develop IEPs. So as we consider the varied needs of our students, also acknowledging that the development of the IEP, as we may at times refer to English learners as a broad group, acknowledging that again, when it comes to each individual IEP, we want you to reflect on the individuality of the student, the needs of the individual student, the English language proficiency of the individual student, and that particular student's individual disability, as we also acknowledge that within each of the disability categories, every child is unique, every child has unique needs. So as we contemplate these questions, again, whether your lens is teacher lens or administrator lens, we're focusing on some key aspects: meaningful parent engagement, ensuring that our programs and placements are appropriate, as we understand that least restrictive environment is going to be the forefront of our mind, as we also consider the fact that special education is a service, a support, a supportive structure that is layered onto as students retain their Tier 1 core designated and integrated ELD. So you'll have more to come during today's session. For a quick glance of Chapter 5, its resources and hyperlinks, there is a hyperdoc of all Chapter 5, and you see the image there, and that might be your next step resource, if you will. So as we delve into Chapter 5 again, these are students who have already been found eligible for special education, and we're going to describe the IEP meeting, the development of the IEP, and ensuring the multidisciplinary team approach as we look at every facet of free and appropriate public education, the development of the IEP, the individualized education plan, acknowledging that least restrictive environment is a goal for all students and general ed is first. All students are general education students first. Evaluation we've covered in a prior session, and we want to continue to focus on meaningful parent participation and engagement. And of course, acknowledging that our ultimate goals are access and educational benefit for each and every one of our students. And knowledge is power. We've heard that again in different venues as we acknowledge the rights of our parents and guardians, that the procedural safeguards are provided to parents and families, that there's a deep understanding of their rights and their ability to advocate for students. And that may not fall in the comfort zone of many of the families that we engage with. And as we want to ensure that parents feel meaningfully engaged, translation of your procedural safeguards. I know that the SELPAs across the state have worked tirelessly to ensure that there are various languages represented, dialects of procedural safeguards. So if you are in a region where maybe you're lacking a certain translation, reach out to your SELPA director. Again, if you're a multi-district SELPA, single district SELPA, we will work together to find that language translation for you as you work again together with your teams. So as IEP teams, as we get started in the IEP process, as you might be an EL specialist participating in this session, and as an EL specialist, what is your lens as you consider English language proficiency and the knowledge regarding comprehensive ELD that you can share with the IEP team and special educators? We want to ensure that these three main items are the focus of our conversations as we develop the IEP for English learners with a disability. Language of instruction, accessibility tools, or the eligibility for alternate assessments, and that's both for LPAC or CASP assessments, and how and where designated ELD instruction will occur. And those are the focus of the conversation as we look towards English learners whom are also dually identified students for English learners with a disability. So although today we will not be developing a complete IEP, our focus is truly as you develop IEPs for, again, your students with disabilities, to have a sharper lens, if you will, as we engage in IEPs for English learners with disabilities. And it truly takes a multidisciplinary team approach. You will hear us say this in various sessions as we continuously bring to the conversation that the decisions made in an IEP aren't the sole decision of the school psychologist, of the speech pathologist, of the administrator at the table. And as administrator, I have to understand, I am not the end all when it comes to an IEP. It is a team approach, a multidisciplinary team approach, whereby in this field where we discuss English learners as students with disabilities, we must ensure that our EL specialists are at the table with us. That is a key missing piece to our IEP teams if we aren't fully discussing the language skills, abilities, and proficiency needs of our students who are English learners. So as you consider IEPs that you've held prior to today for English learners whom also are children with a disability, we want to consider how can we engage our EL specialists? Have EL specialists been invited to your IEP team? And if not, how can we become friends? How can we cross again the hall, knock on the door of the EL specialist so that we can truly build that robust, comprehensive IEP, taking in mind the individual student who's an English learner with a disability? In part, of course, meaningful and active participation of parents and guardians. Our parents and guardians, again, can give us so much information and clues regarding the needs and supports of the child. As we've previously discussed, cultural and linguistic factors, extrinsic factors, as we acknowledge the needs of our students with varied backgrounds, we want to ensure that families, again, are engaged with us, that they have active participation with the procedural safeguards, ensuring that our documents are translated. Many times we understand that we need that verbal translator, interpreter in our IEP meetings. We also want to ensure that should parents and guardians request a translated copy of the written document, that we are prudent and timely in ensuring that families are receiving the translated document in a timely manner. And that's roughly about 30 days. So keep that in mind, that although yes, an oral translator was provided at the time of the meeting, should a parent guardian request the document translated, timely fashion, again, the translation of that document. So keeping that in mind, as again, we want parents to be fully informed, for them to have the documents necessary so that they can also make active, again, decisions and fully informed consent here in California. As we think about active parent engagement, there is a figure in the practitioner's guide that might assist you, as you may be a district who is continuing to strive to engage your parents and families and wanting to look at it from a different lens. This particular resource might be helpful and supportive to you. In addition, the parent report form. The parent report form can be downloaded and fillable via our website, and maybe that tool that assists you with that further engagement in interview practices with families prior to the development of the IEP. As we all know, there's much pre-work in the development of our IEP. Our special educators in the session today, again, very familiar with the IEP process, and we want to gather as much information as we can as we think of students' preferences, students' interests, students' motivating factors, and parents and guardians can again help and support us with that information. And this is a resource that again you may want to download and utilize in support of your development of your draft of your IEP. That then takes us to drafting the present levels of performance. As we gather various data points for drafting the present levels of performance, we have certain educational benefit reminders. Those of you who have referred to your state SELPA IEP manual, these questions will be very familiar to you. If you haven't yet, I would definitely recommend that you contact your SELPA. There is a state SELPA IEP manual that gives you more information of the development of the IEP, as again, today we will walk through every facet of the IEP, but truly highlighting elements of the IEP as we focus on the needs of English learners with disabilities. As we consider the present levels of performance and we think again of students' preferences, strengths, and interests, primary language is a strength. Students have language and language backgrounds that we can then build into the IEP that helps us build our knowledge base and how we may assist students with bridging into the English language. So as we consider present levels of performance, it will go beyond our classroom-based assessments to also include what are our EL adoptions, what does assessment look like in relation to English language proficiency. As we consider the varied needs of our students, and as students this may be their initial, this may be an annual IEP or a triennial IEP, where we're looking at past goals and progress towards goals. We'll also speak to a little bit later linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. And were those goals truly linguistically appropriate, so that as we discuss progress and progress made, it also causes us to reflect on, were the assessments appropriate? Were the assessments culturally and linguistically non-biased for the student? So as we consider the development of present levels of performance, it's added to. What are the additives to the present levels of performance so that we may truly highlight and focus on students' strengths? Yes, we will discuss the needs of our students and how we can continue to support them in the deficit areas that they display, given their unique disability. Because again, given the uniqueness of every child, even within disabilities, every IEP, different, individualized for the particular student. So as you consider curriculum-based assessments, teacher-created assessment tools, observations in multiple settings, portfolios of work, as well as standardized assessments that are available to you, you'll want to again ensure that it's relevant and comprehensive for the student whom you serve. Because as we develop the IEP, we want to ensure that we're identifying all needs and the prioritized needs, again, that will lead to educational benefit for the student. So as we document in the present levels of performance, we're leveraging on and upon the student's strengths. So as we gather observational data, we want to ensure that you have some resources. We encourage you to download these documents and take a few minutes to look at Appendix 4.6 and Appendix 4.7. The English Learner Classroom Observation Checklist, as well as the Focus Observation English Learner during English instruction. These two resources can support you as you engage in deeper dialogue, conversations, observations with your EL specialist, with your ELA English teachers, together as teams, So as we consider the purview of the special education teacher, where you may have conducted academic achievement assessments, you may have some standardized scores that you're also reviewing to, intervention programs that are accessible to students. And as we take that deeper lens into the classroom and engage in conversations with EL specialists of what does designated ELD look like? What are we looking for? How has progress been made? And are we assessing in the specific unique areas in relation to actual documentation of not only students' disability and where those deficits may lie, as well as where those strengths lie. And the same is true for English language proficiency. And what is the interplay there? The compounding factors. So as you engage in observations, again, who's helping you with those observations? As a special educator, you cannot do this work alone. Engaging with your EL specialist is very important. We know that for our EL specialists, sharing information in relation to the LPAC, supportive structures with the LPAC, that again is very common, comfortable conversation for them. For our special educators, however, this may be, again, your starting point. This may be where your comfort level lies, is what does the LPAC say and what does it look like? And that's okay, because we would want to say that at best, at minimum, that we utilize the LPAC information as, again, our reference point as we begin to develop the IEP for our English learner with a disability. It is, again, one data point where we would hope that, again, assessments, deeper assessment regarding receptive and expressive skills, perhaps even the engagement with the speech and language pathologist, should they not already be on the IEP team, your EL specialist, as you conduct intervention tools and intervention-related assessments, perhaps you're able to glean deeper information regarding listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. What does oral language look like in the classroom? What does written language look like? What does the product look like in the classroom? So as we consider the LPAC and as we look at that information, we want to develop our knowledge base. As special educators, we understand that you may not have had a robust training and support in the use of the ELD standards and understanding. But again, through our assessments, perhaps you're conducting other standardized assessments where you too have oral language skill assessment and standardized scores. Perhaps you have phonemic awareness assessments that you can also contribute, where now you're looking for patterns of student strengths and or weaknesses, as we all have a profile of relative strengths and weaknesses. So as you consider oral language performance and written language performance areas, again, you're able to use this data in your present levels of performance to fully and robustly discuss what does communication in English look like for the student whom you're writing the IEP for. So as we consider the ELD standards as part of the process, because that is part of the student's core. For English learners, Tier 1 core services is designated an integrated ELD. So as we consider the ELD standards, we want to, again, as we conduct observations, consider progress, how are students engaged in meaningful ways to collaborate with peers and yourselves as adults. What does that dialogue look like? Does student have a safe place to engage in that dialogue and practice the development of English language proficiency? We also consider, what does comprehension and analysis look like? What are our opportunities to give students the ability to show what they know? Are they provided with additional tools and supports? And my colleagues will delve deeper this afternoon as they discuss educational programming specific to designated and integrated ELD for English learners with disabilities. But again, our starting point may be here, the LPAC score report, as we develop the IEP, develop our understanding of what does it mean to be initial fluent, or what does it mean to be a novice English speaker? What does it mean to have somewhat developed English language proficiency skills? What does that score relate to? So this again may be a starting point for you as a special educator in development of the IEP. And also again, aligning that we're leveraging and meeting needs. Because as we consider the needs of the student and their respective disability category, we're also able to look at this information and think about how we may give students coordinated support to, again, further their progress towards, again, grade level standards and English language proficiency simultaneously. So as we consider then the present levels of performance, our baseline, our base for where we then work upon in our IEP. So if we start with clear and comprehensive data of our student and the individual needs of our student, where we've discussed where IEP goals are necessary to ensure that the student makes adequate progress from year to year for educational benefit, a way to get to educational benefit for many of our students and to give them that entry point that they absolutely need is through these special factors, considerations for assistive technology, considerations for universal supports, designated tools, and accommodations. As we consider the varied needs of our English learners, we want to ensure that we're having active conversations of our instructional systems and what are the supports necessary. As we consider supports, that can take a very broad lens as we think of low-tech to high-tech services and supports that students may need, again, to be successful and to truly have access. When we think about access, we want to then layer on equity and access so that students, again, are able to demonstrate and show what they know, to receptively utilize the information that's been shared and then demonstrate skill. The second main important question as we think about the needs of our English learners in consideration of their English language proficiency skills, as well as their respective disability category and the uniqueness of their disability as it displays in their disability category, we think about English language development. As we then focus on LRE a little bit later through the IEP, we're keeping that in the back of our mind of how and where designated ELD will occur. As we know and understand that integrated ELD occurs across content areas. So that's important to note that as we engage in the IEP process, we're keeping consistent with the ELD standards and that student is going to retain comprehensive ELD, going to retain their Core 1, Tier 1 services as we've discussed in prior sessions. Very important as we acknowledge the IEP process and what that might look like. And yes, our discussion will lead to discussions about specialized academic instruction and where we fit in as special educators to ensure that we are focused on the needs as it relates to the disability. But that's all in retention of core. General ed first, as students, again, are general education first, and we layer on the supports, which may be many, which may be few, again, dependent on the needs of the student. But as we advocate for the needs of our English learners with a disability, we want to ensure that together our EL specialists, our special educators, our administrators, that we have a foundational understanding that every English learner will retain their integrated and designated ELD. Those are non-negotiables as we consider the varied needs of our English learners. So again, as we look towards the needs of our students, we want to then think, are our students children who are receiving ELD right now in special education? Maybe this is an annual and you're thinking through it at a different lens and considering LRE and English language proficiency skills, where maybe that child could receive that service in the general education setting. Or perhaps you're a special educator of students with extensive support needs, students with moderate to severe disabilities, from which you're now using the ELD connectors that are available to you by way of the alternate LPAC blueprint document. And we do have a snapshot there as well. Perhaps that is your guiding tool now as we look at those connectors that have already been scaffolded for you, as you'll see there where you have the general education ELD standard, and then you'll have a connector. So if you will, a scaffold version, a supportive tool for students with disabilities to have that direct connection to make grade level progress towards ELD standards. So as you consider the use of those documents, because again, they will come into play as you develop linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, as we develop the IEP, we want to deepen our understanding of the student's needs, again, as an individual. So as we think about English learner student questionnaire and building that rapport with our student, as yes, when we say varied students in the group of English learners, we may have students who are new to the US, perhaps new to your school, students who are migrant and have traveled along California, where we want to ensure that we fully understand the student, where we want some questions. And this might be that tool to help you as you engage in dialogue and developing an understanding of what is the student's comfort level in English. What is the student's comfort level in their L1, their primary language? And helping again for us to better understand the students whom we serve. This may also require some support where you as an educator may want to say, I don't feel fully comfortable. Do I have access to a translator? Do you have a list of translators available to you so that you can connect with students? Perhaps this is a questionnaire that you decide to utilize both with the student and the family member, the parent or the guardian, where again you may need a translator to help further your understanding about the robust language and educational experiences that the individual English learner may have had. And that again is very different as we consider the needs of English learners, knowing that they may have, again, robust educational backgrounds, varied educational backgrounds, as their families may also have varied educational backgrounds. No one student is alike. So as we consider the IEP and we delve into the needs of the English learner and what are the special factors as we consider in the IEP, what are those additional supports that are needed by English learners to be successful, to have the entry point, the inroad to ensuring access and equity, we start with primary language supports. And we say primary language supports and resources because it's always, again, thinking of forward thinking. How do we proactively consider the needs of our students? We want to ensure that we're not saying language of instruction. That is a parental choice that's outside of the IEP. That choice for a language of instruction other than English would have been discussed at the time of enrollment, through your registrar, and again, those different mechanisms that you have within your respective districts, as we acknowledge that yes, there across California we have bilingual programs, dual immersion programs of different constructs, where again students may be in other programs. For the purpose of the IEP, when we say primary language support, we're truly talking about the resources, accommodations, supports, and adjustments that are made so that students can have access. When we say primary language support, we don't want that to be inferred as a one-to-one. We often get that question, do you mean that our students need an individual translator with them? Not necessarily. Could it perhaps be a recommendation? Perhaps. But that is for the IEP team to discuss the appropriateness that the student needs and supports. As we discuss primary language supports, we're really talking about the tools, the resources, the accommodations that can be made for the student in the classroom. So primary language supports will include, and you'll see a list here. My colleagues will delve deeper into this as we talk about instructional planning and programming for students, but we're truly speaking to how do we make those refinements and adjustments in our everyday instructional practices. Of course, during assessment in the classroom and during statewide assessment as well, but throughout the classroom process. We want to ensure that we integrate this in the IEP because, as I mentioned before, as we leverage, again, what are these high leverage practices that support the student's individual need as a student with a disability, as well as the student's English language proficiency. And we may find that there are accommodations that, again, support both needs as dually identified students. So as we think about our attention to cognates, as we think about speaking and writing and what that looks like, opportunities for the student to use their primary language as a base, a foundation, for then which we build upon and build into English language proficiency. So as we consider the IEP, this may look familiar to many of you. This is just one example. I know many of you use different types of IEP vendors and formats. This is just a snapshot of SACE, as here in our respective county, we utilize SACE, and I know that many of you do as well across California. A big thank you to the State SELPA Association, where we have active conversations about English learners and Englishers with disabilities, and how we can continue to refine the IEP to meet the needs of all students with disabilities, including English learners. And this is one supportive tool that we help, again, will further those conversations during the IEP. So as we consider the language supports, primary language supports for students, as again, language is language. How do we build upon that language is our next step, is our charge. As we support students with building English language proficiency, it may need the support of oral clarification in the child's primary language, for which, yes, we may need a translator. It may be a peer buddy. How comforting is that to have a peer buddy that can assist the child with oral language, where they have peer models now engaging and interacting and supporting, again, this process. This is not an exhaustive list. However, again, it's a supportive tool to support you as practitioners as you have conversations, again, special educators and general educators, having active conversations about what are the needs of the students in particular. So as you think of graphic organizers, we think beyond. What does that graphic organizer look like in respect to the student's need? Yes, we may have a graphic organizer that's available to everyone, but does it have some structures that support the student and leverage language? Can we include some primary language sentence stems? Can we include primary language words? As we think about what this looks like in classroom, we have access to so many tools that it may be an electronic translator, it may be a human translator. It may be, again, a paper-based tool, a computer-based tool that provides a glossary, a translation, a thesaurus that is at our ready to, again, support the student with engagement and understanding of the context, the language, and the cognitive load that they're being exposed to in our classrooms. So as we consider all of these primary language resources, again, it is the IEP team that has the focus and the lens of who is the individual student and how do I ensure, again, that we're supporting the needs. And it comes to accessibility. Because as we consider accessibility in the classroom, it will be that much easier for us to then walk into what is accessibility on statewide assessments. We often start with accessibility in the reference of statewide assessments, but it's not true accessibility if the student doesn't have that ongoing assessment and accessibility tools built in prior to that statewide assessment. It's part of an ongoing cyclical process. And through the IEP team, it's also an iterative process because we have the opportunity to discuss from year to year in the IEP or even from amendment to amendment, as we know we can have as many amendments and many IEPs as we so choose as needed by that child. So this may be your next step. As IEP teams, you may be thinking and reflecting about what have we stated were primary language resources in the IEP? What accessibility tools have we utilized or perhaps not yet utilized? These are the reflective questions that we hope you will ask. It's written in a checklist format because maybe this is a slide you want to print. Have it with you as you discuss with your IEP teams. Perhaps you're an administrator and this is where you want to go next with your special education department in conjunction with your EL specialists, your EL program, your EL coordinators, to talk about what have accessibility resources look like for SBAC and LPAC. What have they look like in the classroom as we look at the students' identified needs in relation to their respective English language proficiency and their respective disability? We also want to look at, have we made adjustments? And this may be the time again to have an adjustment to say, have we considered accessibility tools? Do we need to add further accessibility tools? Perhaps we have primary language resources that we have used, but not during assessment. Perhaps we have primary language resources we've used during assessment, but not ongoingly during instruction. And these will be important conversations to have. As we move forward, yes, we've had many questions regarding domain exemptions, so we will take some time to talk about domain exemptions for the LPAC. So let's consider as we think about statewide assessments for English learners and students with disabilities. Assistive technology. Assistive technology has opened the door for so many of our students, and I'll say open doors, open windows, you name it. We don't want to leave that behind. Now that we have shifted back into in-person instruction, we've recognized that so many tools that we may not have employed on a daily basis have been there, are free resources, free add-ons that are available to our students that we want to continuously use now in the classroom and again during assessment. As we consider all things assistive technology, we want to ensure that, again, as you consider, again, leveraging your skills and abilities as you speak as special educators with your EL specialists, what are those tools? What are those assistive technology tools that, again, may have a dual purpose to support the student as we consider their needs as a child with a disability, and then as we also look at their needs as a child needing to develop their English language proficiency skills. And as we consider, again, the output, the input, and helping students show what they know, we want to equip them with every tool, support, and structure that, again, is going to lead to their success and progress. So as you consider things that are at your availability, this may be the next conversation. Whereas administrators, you may be thinking about, I have some resources and funds right now where we can look at, again, additional supports, where we want to consider enhancing and continuously improving our system. And assistive technology may be that supportive structure where we make some investments towards training of our educators, of course, because as we grow in our understanding of assistive technology, that we then train and support our staff in understanding assistive technology, training our students in the use of that assistive technology so that they can then adequately and appropriately use it during instruction every day, during assessment, and then during statewide assessment. So it is part of that process that for you, you might say, in our system, this might be the missing link. This might be our conversation that we head to next. So as we consider LPAC and student accessibility and the accessibility checklist that CDE has provided, we've had an array of questions. And you probably have an array of questions. Feel free to add them into the chat box as we consider accessibility and the LPAC. So as noted before, we want to ensure that students have access, leveling the playing field, if you will, so that they can have that entry point to instruction, which is fair, because what's fair is what's needed by the individual. As we develop IEPs, we want to ensure that we are having that individual lens, where it's not to say that all students with a disability need every single accommodation, and they may. It is student focused and student dependent as we have this conversation of what are the universal tools, the designated tools, and the accommodations that are necessary for the student to truly be able to receptively engage with the assessment and then demonstrate skill and knowledge. Because is the data true? Is the data true to the child's skill and abilities? So as IEP teams, this particular checklist, I would highly recommend that you sit and review with the IEP team every time you have that annual IEP, as we may decide to adjust and make refinements to the accommodations that have been selected. We may realize that certain accommodations were not effective for the student, where we needed to again discuss how is that tool supportive? How does that student help again with their ability to demonstrate skill? So as we think of each domain specific area, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, the IEP team also has additional knowledge. We have the knowledge to be able to say this is the student's disability, and how does this student's disability impede learning? For which at that point the IEP team may also make some connections to say, based on this child's disability, the disability lies in the area of listening, has impact on their listening skills. This child particularly has a specific learning disability, perhaps, where they have a disability specific to the area of reading, reading comprehension. Perhaps we're seeing other phonological processing disorders where having the impact in reading and further accommodations are necessary to address, again, the need as a disability and the needs as an English language learner. Because as we engage in assessments, and this includes our standardized assessments that we utilize to build our present levels of performance, our intervention tools that we utilize in the classroom, our curriculum-based assessments and tools, We're always accommodating again to ensure that the student truly has access and that the data that we're gathering is truly relevant of the student whom we're assessing. So as we think of each of these domain areas, we would want the IEP team to have an active discussion. For this child and their relative disability, what does listening look like? What are the potential impacts? Speaking, reading, writing. As you consider universal supports, designated supports, and accommodations, you may also then find that despite the prior efforts, we have engaged in the use of accommodations. We have ensured that the student has access. We have exhausted the accommodations that we feel are appropriate, and yet the assessment is not accessible. Because remember, we're in the practice of supporting students, not that we're fixing or changing the child, but rather how do we ensure that the conditions are appropriate for the student to demonstrate skill? That may lead again to that domain exemption. This might be new to your IEP teams. We recognize that many IEP teams in this last year, this has been new to you to have this conversation about the possibility of a domain exemption through the IEP process. Students with an IEP, because of their disability, again, the disability itself may have significant impact on the accessibility of the assessment tool, for which then the argument potentially would be that the assessment itself is assessing the disability and is not truly assessing English language proficiency. If that is the case, that the IEP recognizes that we've looked at all of the accommodations, we've tried and exhausted these accommodations, student has an understanding of how to use the accommodations during assessment. The assessment administrator, so whomever is assigned to administer that assessment, has engaged in appropriate use of those accommodations, and yet the student is struggling. We may then discuss the domain exemptions. So as we consider domain exemptions, again, the IEP is so important. We also want to ensure that, is this directly related to the disability? For which we also have IEP goals that are linguistically appropriate, and that'll be our next conversation. But as we consider the linguistically appropriateness of the goal of the IEP, do we see a through line there that supports, again, the why of exempting a domain? And I share this because, again, it's relatively new to IEPs, and we want to ensure that it's an individualized practice. Albeit also, remember, should you, again, domain exempt, you will receive a score. We may see that students, again, will demonstrate more skill, will have an increase in their actual scores and their overall composite, which, again, is very helpful to truly demonstrate progress. And that's really what we want, is to ensure that we are acknowledging the progress of students. And then lastly, we may have students through the IEP team process, we discuss the need for alternate assessments, where our students have a significant cognitive disability for which the administration of the California Alternate Achievement Assessment is most appropriate, and now the administration of the alternate LPAC is most appropriate moving forward. So this, again, is maybe a newer element to some IEP teams where you're taking more pause and reflection to the accessibility tools. And again, remember, accessibility during everyday instruction leading up and into the assessment process. So as we consider statewide assessments, we're then taking what we learned from that present levels of performance. What are all of the baseline skills of the students? And through that information, we're then understanding, do we need refinements in accommodations? Do we need the addition of accommodations for students to, again, to truly demonstrate their skills and ability and show what they know? The alternate LPAC, in its newness to the field, is another resource. As I mentioned, if you are an administrator, an educator of students with significant cognitive disabilities, students with moderate to severe disabilities, this particular resource might be helpful to you as you also develop your present levels of performance, as you consider special factors, because the task types are very informational. The more that we know about the ELD standards, the ELD connectors for students with significant cognitive disabilities, we're able to then fully integrate and have, again, that supportive structure as we consider the needs of our students who are English learners with a disability. This particular resource that you see there is one of our latest infographics that does walk through all of the task types for the alternate LPAC. The alternate LPAC blueprint is also linked in. As we consider the needs of our students who are English learners with disabilities, those ELD connectors are our new hidden gem, something that we can utilize as we shape instruction and as we also look at what are the primary language resources that our students need that's necessary to develop their English language proficiency skills. So again, this may be a particular resource that you glean to next. Whoa, sorry about that. I'm heavy-handed on the clicker today. Maybe I'm just pointing in the wrong place. There we go. So as you consider universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations, again, you have the accessibility resource matrix available to you. I know that we're going to head into a break because we promised that we'd give you a break every hour on the hour. So if you don't mind, I think this is the next resource that you'll want to download because it is the newest iteration of the California Accessibility Resource Matrix. We want to ensure that you have access to it as it does provide, again, a visual of LPAC accommodations, CASP accommodations, whether SPAC or CAA. And this may be the next deeper conversation that your IEP teams have, or maybe as a department of special educators, EL specialists, and then of course, as we said, together. The togetherness is where we want to move our system as we think about the collective commitment as we improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. So with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break. And we'll see you back in 10 minutes. We'll be watching the chat box. If you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A. And we'll check the Q&A during the break and answer any questions you may have for me regarding the first segment of this morning. Thanks so much. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Back from our break. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you gave yourself some rest and repose in those quick 10 minutes. I know that Zoom fatigue is real. And with all of the resources that we're providing you today, I hope that, again, this gives you an opportunity to go back and review and reflect and pick and choose those resources that best support your needs and needs of your IEP teams as you elevate and support your work towards, again, improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. So where we left off before the break was regarding the California Accessibility Resources Matrix. We emphasize the use of the matrix as it is a very important structure and tool to support our IEP teams. I say teams in truly that effect, multidisciplinary teams, as we engage in deeper conversations about universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations. To be clear, always knowing that universal supports are for all students, designated supports are for all students, including students with an IEP or a 504, and accommodations available to all students with disabilities, students on an IEP or a 504. As we consider accommodations, again, always remembering, maybe a little bit of demystifying, that accommodations are allowable. They do not change the standard. They do not lower standards. Really, accommodations support and have a focus as an entry point to assist students have accessible instruction, accessible assessments that, again, help them demonstrate skill and ability. So as you consider the resource matrix, there is an Padlet in your Padlet. So there is an additional Padlet regarding all things CASP and LPAC. My colleague Vanessa Lopez is always available to any in the field, as again, this is definitely her wheelhouse as she assists and supports LEAs, SELPAs, COEs through our grant work, considering deeper acknowledgement of assistive technology and accessibility tools as we support our students in making growth. As we consider the needs of your particular region, you may be a region, district, COE, SELPA, who accessibility is your entry point, where you decide in order to improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities, this is where we want to invest more time, talent, resources, and practice, and that's okay. So as you consider the needs of accessibility, I have to again preface that the more time and support that we invest in our staff, and helping them know and understand how to use the accessibility resources so that they in turn can assist and support our students in how to effectively use the resources, the accommodations that are available to them, then we will see greater progress again in our system and of course progress made by our students. So these particular resources are there for you to peruse. I would highly recommend that you save this particular Padlet as well, as this again may be the next step for you. You'll see various resources there as you are working towards developing a more robust IEP in respect of your English learners and English learners with disabilities. That takes us to our next segment, which is linguistically appropriate objectives. Linguistically appropriate objectives are a segment that we want to ensure that you know early on. We will have a follow-up to today's session on March 28th. It will be via Zoom as well, broadcasted statewide. It will be video and archived, as well as, of course, this session will be video archived. Our linguistically appropriate goals and objective sessions that is occurring on March the 28th will be in collaboration with the system improvement leads, which Kevin Schaefer, many of you may be familiar with him, will be collaborating with us and presenting alongside with us in the development of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. So we're going to walk into an introduction to linguistically appropriate goals and objectives today in this next segment. As mentioned earlier, present levels of performance, special factors, and accessibility leading into the goals and objectives. Why? Because the more we know about the student's baseline, that we are very clear on the skills and abilities that our students have and what those skills look like in any of the respective areas that the IEP team has determined is a need as a result from the disability. We also then consider the linguistic needs of the student's English language proficiency level. The more that we know and understand, again, through the present levels of performance, as we looked at the various artifacts that were available to us, the LPAC, as we looked at the ELD adoption within your particular district and assessments related to English language proficiency in accordance with that adoption, as we bring that information together, we can then build truly linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. As discussed with the accessibility tools, the importance of the accessibility tools, because when we provide the right conditions for students, students can truly demonstrate. As we look at goals and objectives as truly a marker to show, has a student made progress? Has a student worked towards educational benefit from year to year towards grade level Common Core state standards? So all of these artifacts are building up to a solid baseline for then we know where do we go next in development of that goal. What is the next skill that we want to support, foster, teach so that the student can make successive growth? But before we go too deep into linguistically appropriate, we do have an FAQ. So we'd love to hear your response in the chat box. So go ahead and get ready with your chat box. Must English language development, ELD goals, be included in the IEP? Take a moment, yes or no, and it's totally okay to say, I'm not sure. Must ELD goals be included in the IEP? Go ahead and flood the chat. We want to see a flood waterfall in the chat. Yes, no, I'm not sure, maybe so. It's okay. We'd love to hear from you. My moderators are saying lots of responses are coming in through the chat box. Okay. So you may be an EL specialist and you may be thinking, well, I don't necessarily write IEPs. Still chime in the chat box. You're fully included. We want to assist and support you as you then assist and support your IEP teams. Maybe you're thinking about FPMs. I know that question comes up a lot. So without further ado, let's go to the response. And the answer is no. The answer is no. ELD goals are not a requirement of the IEP. Rather, linguistically appropriate goals and objectives are required in the IEP. So let's unpack that a little bit. So as we think about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, there is specific language regarding goals that must be developed in the areas of need as it relates to the student's disability. So as we consider disability, we are thinking disability first. We are considering the unique disability category of the student. So as noted, the student will have a disability, a primary disability, perhaps a secondary disability, for which the IEP team is considering the individual need of the student, how that disability significantly impacts progress towards general education, progress, Common Core state standards. So the student's involvement in general education. So that's our threshold, our Common Core state standard. As we think of the student's need as it relates to disability, our present levels of performance. Again, the importance to know the baseline, where goals are absolutely needed to ensure that the student is making progress, that we are identifying and addressing those needs as it relates from the disability. Then we layer, what are the student's needs as an English learner? Well, our state and federal regulations tell us that we need to ensure that we are linguistically appropriate, that students are taken into consideration for the individuals that they are as a dually identified student. So as an English learner with a disability, we will then focus on the needs as it results from language and literacy skills. The LPAC again may be your first starting point when you consider baseline. So you may be a special educator who has developed tons of goals. We ask you to then reflect about the goals that you've written prior to today. Did you check off the box that said linguistically appropriate, and was it truly linguistically appropriate? If the goal is truly linguistically appropriate, it will have some basic markers. It will give us information regarding students' baseline skills towards English language proficiency, which may be more than, but at minimum include information that we gleaned from the LPAC assessment or the alternate LPAC. And we will get alternate LPAC scores later in the summer. That information can help you build the baseline, and for which, as I showed before on the LPAC summary reports, at least that as your starting point. The more information we have, of course, we want to gather all the data accessible to us. But to truly develop linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, we need some insight regarding the student's English language development skills. So with that, are ELD goals specifically required? No, they are not. What is required is linguistically appropriate goals. So goals that are aligned to the California ELD standards, as well as the California grade level Common Core state standards. Because that is our requirement of the IEP, that we then monitor progress towards grade level curriculum, which in turn is grade level standards. So as we think of the baseline skills of our students, whether or not they're at grade level, our responsibility is to give students access to grade level curriculum, grade level standards, again, provided those accommodations. The accommodations, again, will not hinder students' progress. Accommodations do not hinder a student's ability to earn a grade. And accommodations do not hinder a student's ability to then perhaps later be reclassified if we are using accommodations on the LPAC. So with that, when we consider all that we know as we walk through present levels of performance, what are the interests and skills and abilities of the students? What are the potential deficit areas as uniquely impacted by that student's disability? What is the student's English language proficiency? So the more comprehensive and thorough our present levels of performance is that speaks to the student's skills and abilities, we're then able to now write linguistically appropriate goals that are relevant to the particular student. Again, as noted before, the English language development standards and now the ELD connectors for students with significant disabilities will be your entry points to ensure that your goals are truly linguistically appropriate. So you may be an EL specialist participating in this session, and you're going to say, well, I thought that as part of the FPM process, the question was, do I have an ELD goal? Our responsibility is to effectively demonstrate that the goal is written taking into consideration ELD standards, that it's written to take into consideration the student's individual English language proficiency level. So again, as we work together, the more information we have regarding the ELD standards, which may be our special educators, gleaning and leveraging the expertise of our EL specialists to support our development of goals and objectives. So with that, we wanted to give you an opportunity to explore, to look at some examples of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives at various grade levels, to give you an opportunity to read through the goals, to look at the information, and have some opportunity to reflect on how these goals may look a lot like the goals you're already writing, or perhaps will assist you with embedding more accessibility, support, and the ELD standards into your development of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. So with that, we're going to give you about 10 minutes. We'll give you 10 minutes to explore. During that time, though, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We're going to monitor the Q&A, but take 10 minutes to review each of those. We have a grade 3, a 7, and an 11-12 that are written to be linguistically appropriate. So we'll give you that time and we'll circle back. So again, what you're reviewing is the grade level linguistically appropriate goals and what they look like. And again, these are samples. You don't have all the baseline data that you need, but again, to give you an example. Okay. So you had an opportunity to review some examples of linguistically appropriate goals. And again, not to say that this is the most perfect example, because what are we missing? Here you have just a glimpse of what the baseline skills are of the student. For your respective students, you will clearly be able to articulate what does reading comprehension look like? What does literacy skills look like? And not just scores, but definitions of what it looks like in practice. We want to be very clear that as we consider the baseline, it should be very explicit that from the information and assessments that we gathered through the development of the present levels of performance, as the present levels of performance changes year to year, as we update the present levels of performance with new observations, new data, curriculum-based assessments, as we look at all of that information, that is our baseline for which we build our goals. And the same is true for the ELD standards. So as we develop and build our skill and knowledge of the ELD standards and where the child is progressing towards the ELD standards by use of the LPAC assessment data and information, in addition to our ELD standards adoption, we can then again build goals that are truly linguistically appropriate. So in the chat box, you shared some wonderings as well. We'll continue to review any wonderings you have and respond. So with that, we do want to say that, as you build your linguistically appropriate goals and as you consider, we'd love to hear from you any new learnings or wonderings that you still hold. Because as we move forward with today's session, we will have an opportunity to delve into Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 as we build our knowledge towards English language development, the ELD standards, and how this will support you as then we look at it in practice. What is instruction, pedagogy, instructional planning look like in respect to our English learners with disabilities? So as you still may have wonderings, please do add them in the chat as we will continue to respond to any of the wonderings and questions that you may have. So with that, we want to ensure that the uniqueness of students is always at the forefront of our mind, that English learners are a diverse group of students. Yes, we have students that you may traditionally think of newcomers, students who have newly arrived and may have adequate schooling, may not have adequate schooling. Students who have had formal background and education are fluent readers and fluent proficient in their primary language. Our approach, our instruction, our development of goals will be different, again, given the varied needs of our students. As we then consider primary language resources and accessibility tools, again, the more we know about the individual student and their respective background and their unique disability, we will build IEPs that are truly individualized for our English learners with disabilities. We may be also serving long-term English learners. where we may reflect on what are the accommodations that we have provided. Has the assessment truly been reflective of the skills and abilities that the individual student has? Have we been assessing disability instead of language? So as we consider the students who are at risk of becoming long-term English learners, perhaps that is your starting point. As multidisciplinary teams, administrators, EL specialists, general educators, special educators, as we come together and fully inform each other as a multidisciplinary team of who is the child, their respective disability, their respective English language proficiency skills, and as we look at these three prongs, primary language resources and supports, as we look at the development IEP from the lens of where will designated ELD occur. That'll be our next prong. And as we continue to ensure that accessibility tools are used throughout, that students are afforded with the necessary accessibility throughout their instruction. So as we consider in the IEP now, free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environment from the continuum of supports and services. As I mentioned, general ed first. If we plant our feet solidly in general ed and acknowledge that all students are general education students first, we also reflect on what is core. Within your respective district, COE, SELPA, as you work together, what are the tiers of intervention that exist? What are the supportive structures and tools that exist for students at your specific school? So that we can ensure that we exhaust all of the general education supports, for which then we can then apply those accommodations and give students greater access to general education curriculum and instruction. We may require the layering of special education supports, for which, yes, we may have students that are part of a co-teaching model, a push-in model, and perhaps a pull-out model. Students with more extensive needs, significant disabilities, where they may have specialized academic instruction in a special education setting. But as we work as teams to ensure that students are supported effectively, that the least restrictive environment starts in general education, and that special education is a service, a support, not a place, a go-to. However, when we think of, again, what it's looked like in the last year, we have had students served in very restrictive settings. Can we shift and move? Perhaps that's the next segment for your respective region, your respective school site, to talk about what does LRE look like for the English learner with a disability. Are students receiving their comprehensive ELD? These are important questions to ask as special educators of English learners with disabilities, where again, our best friend right now is our EL specialist, who can give us a broad description of what does comprehensive ELD look like at your respective school site. Are students being afforded the opportunity to be integrated with their non-disabled peers, as that is our goal for all students with disabilities, to have the maximum extent appropriate to be alongside non-disabled peers in general education environments. And this might be that next step, where perhaps students with disabilities were receiving designated ELD in special education settings. Perhaps our IEP team could have deeper conversations about, with accommodations, with accessibility tools, with deeper supports, could we then explore lesser restrictive environment so that the student can participate alongside other students who are at the same English language proficiency level as themselves. So as we can potentially group students who, based on the same assessment, the LPAC administration, with accommodations, perhaps without accommodations, as we look at the needs of the individual students, this might be the next step towards a lesser restrictive environment. And again, ensuring that all English learners are receiving core instruction. If inadvertently a student with a disability perhaps has not retained their designated ELD instruction, this would be the time to hold that IEP amendment and discuss. Where will the child receive designated ELD? In the special education environment or the general education environment, and how? With accommodations, perhaps even with modifications to further support the student having access to non-disabled peers in a general education environment. So as we go through each of these prongs of the IEP, it gives us opportunities for pause and reflection, as every team is different. School sites are different. Sometimes school sites within the district are different. For our administrators participating in this webinar, you may be thinking about, what are our policies and procedures? What does our EL master plan say about designated ELD and what that looks like on the classroom? How does that look like for individual students? In so doing, we may want to go back and observe and ensure that, yes, all students, including English learners with disabilities, have retained access to designated ELD. And by way of the IEP, they can make informed decisions, which includes the EL specialist, in having further discussions of how the student can meaningfully engage and have access to designated ELD and those necessary ELD standards for their grade level. So this might be the next step of conversation, perhaps even an IEP amendment to further discuss for individual students. So as we think about the individual needs of our students, we as California educators want to clearly plant our feet in this understanding that together we can all come around and say, yes, we all believe that English learners with disabilities, like all students, are able to attain content standards, and they will need specialized support to do so. That specialized support does not water down standards. That specialized support does not remove students from access to non-disabled peers, but rather, how do we design specialized support so that students can further access to general education curriculum and standards and their non-disabled peers? Whereby, again, it is that multidisciplinary team having the collective commitment together to acknowledge what are the needs of English learners, students with disabilities, and this dually identified student with a disability. So as we think of those multiple needs, and yes, they are compounding needs. For the student with a disability, it may be even harder to disaggregate what is the language difference need and what is the disability need, and where that multidisciplinary team can collectively engage in these conversations. So as we think of this intersection, English language proficiency skills of students who also have a disability. And we say disability because, again, within those 13 disability categories, the student may have a specific learning disability. The child may be a child with autism. So you'll have to think in your mind of the respective students whom you serve. If you're a special education teacher, who are the students on your caseload? And you may be thinking, I have 3 students who have a primary disability, specific learning disability, but yet their specific learning disability manifested in different ways. Maybe each one has a different processing disorder. Of your children whom you serve, maybe 10 on your caseload are children with autism. And as we know, again, some children with autism have cognitive disability, significant cognitive disabilities, and some do not. Profiles of students with disabilities are different and unique and individualized. So as we think about your multidisciplinary team approach, or perhaps you're on the other side of this intersection thinking, I need to include others into my multidisciplinary team. As special educators, we cannot do this work in isolation. So we want to give you an opportunity to stop and pause and reflect via a scenario. This is the main question that you'll keep in the back of your mind as you consider this intersectionality of English language proficiency and serving students with a disability. How does your multidisciplinary team address the needs of dually identified students in the IEP process? What has your IEP process look like, from development of the draft, the present levels, accessibility tools, and then to your decisions that you're making through the IEP team process? So with that, we want you on your own to pause and reflect on these questions. So you're going to hold on to these questions because we're going to move into a scenario. If you recall, early in this session, I shared with you these 3 key decisions that are the base of the IEP team when you're considering English learners with disabilities. So yes, it takes lots of development of the IEP, but when we think about how we're going to focus and sharpen our lens in relation to key decisions for students, we talked about, again, how and where comprehensive ELD will occur. The how will be part of our next segment as we consider Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, Educational Programming. Primary language supports and resources, to include lastly accessibility tools. So those three main prongs are under the purview of the IEP team. Those are the key decisions that you will have engaged in through the IEP process, and perhaps maybe gaps in practice in your respective district. But here's an example. We want you to meet Cruz. Cruzita is a child that is part of the student scenario, and each of the chapters have a student scenario in the California Practitioner's Guide. They're very helpful for you to have an example, perhaps a tool, to deepen your work as teams at your respective school sites. But we want to give you some time that you engage with the student scenario independently. You're going to read her IEP process. So from the lens and the look of their multidisciplinary team, how they walked into the IEP process, the preparation, and the use of those artifacts to then develop the IEP. The student scenario is linked into this particular slide deck. It's also included in the Padlet, and I believe it's also in your chat box. So the student scenario is there. It is rather long, which is good. It's comprehensive and robust. I'm giving you a clue. You'll have an opportunity to review the scenario in its totality, keeping in mind again that under the purview of the IEP is primary language supports and resources, the development of linguistically appropriate goals, the use of accessibility tools. We want you throughout to share in the chat box any key findings. Key findings, ahas, bright spots, if you will, something that resonated with you. Share that with us in the chat box. In the Q&A section, however, we want to hear your questions and wonderings. It's important for us to know what the questions and wonderings are in the field so that we can further assist and support you as we move forward. So you'll have 10 minutes to take in and consume, read through the scenario regarding Cruz and her IEP team development. Again, key findings in the chat box, wonderings in the Q&A. Thank you, and you have 10 minutes. Okay, so as you had an opportunity to meet Cruz and review her scenario, the various artifacts that they utilized to develop the IEP, to come to that conclusion that in fact the child has a disability, also has needs as it relates to English language development and English language proficiency, there are some things that are left to assumption. We do recognize that because, again, we're thinking about a scenario that is fictitious. It may resonate with some of the practices. You may also be considering, as you reviewed this particular scenario, of what are the standardized assessment tools that you utilize in your respective school site? What does direct instruction look like in your respective classrooms? What is the ELD adoption for your respective school site? What is the implementation of that adoption? What are the accessibility tools that you have utilized and employed for your English learners with disabilities? All of these reflections should be coming to mind as you read this scenario, and perhaps even compare and contrast. What are the similarities between this scenario and your multidisciplinary team? And maybe where are some gaps in practices or refinements can be made? So with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break. It is at the 10:30 mark, and we promised a break every hour on the hour. So we'll have 10 minutes. Again, I hope that you take your eyes off the screen for a little while, give yourself some rest and repose for those 10 minutes. I know that some of you are multitasking. In part, we also want to continue to hear your key findings in the chat box and any wonderings in the Q&A. Specifically, your wonderings we love to hear as we can continue to respond during the break. And then, of course, any reflections, key findings, things that resonated with you in the chat. Again, we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you so much. Okay. Welcome back from your break. I hope you took an opportunity to take a break, Thank you for all of the questions in the Q&A and all of the reflections in the chat box. There were some very relevant questions regarding the use of specific standardized assessment tools. Someone made reference to the Ortiz assessment, and if you want more information on assessments and comprehensive, valid, linguistically appropriate assessments and assessment tools, we did host Dr. Samuel Ortiz in a prior session, which is on our website, which you can watch if you're an assessor, school psychologist, speech language pathologist. That would definitely be the assessment segment that you would want to watch, as well as section 1 and section 2. If you missed those prior segments of this series, as this is a series of each of the sections included in the California Practitioner's Guide, all of the resources chapter by chapter are in your Padlet, and the recordings for the prior sessions are hosted on our website. They are archived. You can use them, reuse them, use them as future training tools for yourself and or for your staff. Because yes, there's lots of information that comes into and prior to this particular scenario. Considerations of what are Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instruction, as we recognize again that Tier 1 instruction is comprehensive ELD, including designated ELD. Through the lens of the student with a disability, we acknowledge again that the student must retain comprehensive ELD, and the IEP team under their purview is reviewing how and where designated ELD will occur. As we consider least restrictive environment, we consider what are the needs of the student to have, to the maximum extent appropriate, access to their non-disabled peers. In part, when we think about what that instruction looks like, it delves right into someone in the chat box who asked the question and had a reflection regarding what does designated ELD look like in the special education environment. So perhaps a student has a significant cognitive disability and receives special education supports and services whereby the team has decided that designated ELD will occur in the special education environment. So that's to say that the designated ELD focus is on the ELD standards specifically and opportunities for the student to engage in the use of English language proficiency skills. And that is our next segment as we later look and review Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 regarding instructional programming for students with disabilities who are English learners. As you consider the IEP in its totality, we do have a resource for you. The California Practitioner's Guide in Appendix 5.1 has the IEP team checklist for English learners. This will be absolutely a supportive tool for our special educators as well as our EL specialists. For our EL specialists, as you access this appendix, many of the questions may seem very familiar to you as they are also present in a slightly variation in the FPM process, as students whom are English learners with a disability are part of that sampling when you go through that process of FPM. This particular checklist may be part of your future work. We always like to encourage teams to consider future work, as this is a one-day opportunity of an overview that gives you only a certain depth of understanding of the IEP development in relation to supporting and serving English learners with disabilities. So this IEP checklist may be your next entry point, where as a team you come together, take a random sample of IEPs that have been developed at your school site, perhaps within your district, maybe by your SELPA, as you think again, whom are our students whom are English learners with disabilities? How have their IEPs been developed? And where we might want to make refinements moving forward to ensure again that our IEPs are linguistically and appropriate for the students whom we serve. So these are some items that you'll want to discuss and share as a result from this project, if you will, that you'll engage with your multidisciplinary team. I highly encourage it as we look at the data and artifacts as we engage as continuous learners and working within our system of improvement. Part of that continuous improvement process includes multidisciplinary teams, general educators and special educators. You may be a district who you are focusing on the needs of your subgroup of English learners and your subgroup of students with disabilities. Perhaps this is through the differentiated assistance process. the ATSI, the CSI process, where you've acknowledged that there are perhaps some deeper needs and supports that are needed by your English learners and your English learners with disabilities. This might give you an opportunity to reflect on what those IEPs look like for your dually identified learners and further assist you in this trajectory of progress for our students and support of your staff, who again may have had limited exposure to the ELD standards or limited knowledge of the relationships that we can build as special educators and general educators. So in our next segment, we're going to focus more on the how ELD designated instruction is crafted and designed to focus on the needs of English learners with disabilities. We reviewed language of instruction through the use of primary language resources and supports and some examples, accessibility tools, and or decisions that are necessary should a student be eligible for alternate assessments. As we delve into Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, the hows will come to fruition. What does that look like for students in practice? Again, as we look at English language proficiency, English language development of students, and their unique disability category always at the forefront. So at this point, again, we're going to switch off. You're going to hear from my colleague Lupita Olguin-Rubio next as we look at Chapter 6 of the California Practitioner's Guide. I will now take a position with my dear friend Vanessa as we look at, again, your new learnings and wonderings. We love to hear you. Don't be shy in the chat box as you share with us your reflections and existing wonderings. So with that, I'm going to hand it off. Again, remember you have lots of figures, appendices in Chapter 5 to support you. They are all in your Padlet. Feel free to download, utilize, rebrand any type of resource that you see. Yeah, my colleague's joining me now as Lupita engages. If any of the frequently asked questions that you heard in Chapter 5, know that they are there to help and support you. We know that at times we seem to demystify information that exists in the field, and the Q&A might be a supportive tool for you. So as we get into Chapter 6, I'll hand it over to Lupita. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning still, and welcome to Imperial County. We're very happy to host you here today. Before I begin diving into Chapter 6 and addressing many of the questions that you have regarding ELD, I want to reiterate the dynamics of our team. Here in the Imperial County SELPA and through this grant, Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities, we appreciate and are honored to have the opportunity to come together from the different camps, if you will. My background and by training, I am an elementary school teacher. By training, that's who I am, and have been at the County Office of Education 18 years in curriculum instruction as an ELD lead, Title III lead, EL specialist, anything and everything under literacy for English learners. So I bring that lens to this team, to this work, very important work, as my colleagues Vanessa and Debbie bring their wealth of expertise and experience in all things special education and special education with English learners. So I'm honored to be part of this team and to help push forward this work at the local, regional, and state level. Our commitment is a collective commitment, and we model that in that we bring that expertise and experience and passion for this work and for the children that we serve in this great state of California and their diverse needs. So it's important for you to know that bringing our lenses together helps make systems better, and it improves and continues to improve the systems that continue to evolve. I mean, just these last couple of years, our systems have taken a tremendous turn, and we've learned a lot. We've learned about what works, what needs improvement, and all of that is what helps us to continuously improve to address the very unique needs of English learners and English learners with disabilities. So I'm going to gently get off my soapbox, but I think it's really important that you know and understand the intentionality of this team, of the dynamics of this team, and what we plan and intend to bring to you through many activities such as this one. So back to our presentation. Our next focus for the next hour or so is going to be on resources and content found in Chapter 6 of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. We are still in Section 3, which involves 3 chapters. We're focusing on Chapter 6 right now, that specifically focuses on educational programming, more specifically, access and equity for English learners with disabilities. You have all of these resources, including the infographic that was created by our very talented Vanessa Lopez, in the Padlet. And again, the infographic, I think, is a tremendous tool, a very useful tool to help you dive into this one chapter. As you can see, is multifaceted and has many components that have very specific details and nuances that really require us to bring together our respective expertise, general ed, special education, as we dive into and think about our processes, our services, our approaches to addressing the needs of English learners with disabilities. The questions here at the beginning of every chapter are organized in 2 categories, one of them specifically for practitioners and the other one specifically for administrators. Again, this is a guiding document that helps inform our practices, to help us rethink, refine, reshape our current practices so that we can provide better services, more accurate, more deliberate, more effective services for English learners and English learners with disabilities. So I want to ask you to just take a quick moment to peruse through these questions, perhaps select one question that is most relevant to you today, so that could be kind of your guiding question as we move through Chapter 6. It's important for you to identify your why, your purpose for engaging, and really thinking about what are some of the changes that you can make within your sphere of influence to begin to start being part of that continuous improvement process. Because even though we're here to talk about specifically resources and tools in support of English learners with disabilities, we all know, we've been in the field long enough to know that without change, then what is it that we expect in terms of improvement? It's so important that we think about our role in the system and that we do have a tremendous responsibility within that system to address more effectively the needs of English learners and English learners with disabilities. So again, select a question that you're kind of really thinking, I really like this question, something I've been thinking about that's most relevant for you, and kind of keep that question in the back of your mind as we move through Chapter 6. So Chapter 6 focused specifically on educational programs for English learners with disabilities. We're going to be talking and delving into how to provide access to comprehensive curriculum that includes English language development and English learner services and supports that relate to disability-related services for English learners, and how federal and state law support and guide us in doing that, the resources that are provided for us to do that. So federal and state law require that we provide all English learners with disabilities with the right to free and appropriate public education, which includes access to the core curriculum within the instructional day, within the least restrictive environment, which in essence means that this is an opportunity for students to engage to the maximum of interaction with their non-disabled peers. Our educational programs for English learners with disabilities should be designed with their assets in mind, with their strengths in mind, as well as with the appropriate supports that are necessary for their very unique disability-related needs. So again, all of this is going to help us really think about and understand how to better meet the needs of English learners with disabilities. Legal regulations are important and necessary because it helps us better understand how to address the educational rights of English learners with disabilities. It helps us work together more collaboratively to help impact the educational programs to better meet their needs, to better provide access to the core curriculum, to better provide access to EL services, and in essence, have an impact on continuous improvement of these supports. So another guiding document, a very important one for all of our English learners in the state of California, which include English learners with disabilities, is the English Learner Roadmap. The English Learner Roadmap was approved by the State Board of Education in 2017. And the purpose and the design of the English Learner Roadmap is to inform and guide LEAs in the state of California. It is California state policy to ensure that we have equitable, accessible resources, curriculum, and support for English learners. The design of the English Learner Roadmap is to do exactly that. And again, the English Learner Roadmap includes English learners with disabilities. It is comprised of a mission, a vision, and 4 guiding principles. These 4 guiding principles help us really think about our current systems, how to collaborate, and it calls out for administrators and educators to work together to help take a closer look at our systems, take a closer look at how we interact with each other in support of our systems that directly impact educational outcomes for English learners. So in order for us to become more familiar with the guiding principles, I want to ask you to take a few moments and watch this very short video clip that calls out the 4 guiding principles of the English Learner Roadmap. Before you take a look at the video clip, I want you to think about your current practices, your current services, and approaches addressing the needs of English learners, as well as your English learners with disabilities. As you watch these 4 guiding principles, I want you to think about how some or all of these guiding principles are coming to life in your processes, services, and approaches, your current practices. Are they there? Are they evident? To what degree are they evident? Do you recognize some of these principles currently? So we're going to start the video, and then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about those guiding principles.
The California English Learner Roadmap is the new policy for English learners in the state of California. It supersedes the old Proposition 227 policy and puts in place instead a common mission and vision for all of our schools and a roadmap for how to get there. That roadmap consists of 4 research-based principles, which really speak to the different aspects of what we have to put in place and the connections between the two. And those principles are, number 1, asset-based education that values and builds on the languages and cultures students bring and that provides them with truly affirming and safe, welcoming schools. This is an era that is about embracing the languages and the cultures children bring and providing all of our students, to the extent we can, with opportunities to develop proficiency in 2 or more languages. The second principle really speaks to the quality of the intellectual work that our children are exposed to in their classrooms, of the quality of teaching and learning. High-level standards with meaningful access provided by teachers who know how to scaffold participation and support our students in really participating in class and mastering everything they need to, overcoming language barriers, learning the English they need. And it also speaks to the importance of us assuring access to all of those college preparatory classes that every child needs in order to leave our high schools, college, and career ready. Principle number 3 is about investing in a system with the resources, the assessments, with the professional development, the leadership development that we need in order to carry off the kind of teaching and learning that our students require. Systems includes everything from, do we have assessments that really tell us whether our children are learning and what's happening to them in both of their languages and in ways that are really reliable information for teachers and for accountability. Systems includes having the teaching staff with the skills needed to meet the needs of their English learners and the processes of professional development and professional support for them so they can continue to learn the skills they need. Systems is about having leadership that understand English learner needs and are prepared with the skills and the approaches to really act upon that knowledge and to hold their schools accountable for moving along a path of continuous improvement toward the goals of the kind of schools we need. If we don't make those investments, it ends up just being pretty words on a page. And that's where it really falls to everybody at the local level to see to it that this roadmap guides our financial planning, our local control accountability planning, and our own school site planning. And the fourth principle is about an articulated system, a connected system from preschool all the way through to high school graduation, all moving in the same direction to ensure that our students get the education they need. Alignment and articulation all the way from preschool through graduation from high school. Coherence across the system. So what happens in one school is connected to what happens in another school. And so as children move from grade to grade to grade, they're receiving a pathway of education that is connected, aligned, and coordinated. What we know now is that early education is a crucial part of our system, that we have to start early when those brains are just wired for language and cognitive development, those crucial years that build a foundation for later success. That we need a system that invests in early childhood education and connects it all the way up in a pathway through to high school graduation. What the roadmap tries to do is to lay out a comprehensive view of all the things that would be happening to really support English learners. Everything from ensuring access to ensuring the quality of education, to seeing to it that teachers have the skills they need to pull that off, to seeing to it that there's assessment that is reliable and valid for them. By painting that comprehensive picture of what needs to be in place, and by saying, as a state, we're reaching toward this vision of education that prepares our kids with 21st century skills, with proficiency in multiple languages, we are all moving together on a road toward the same goal.
So again, the English Learner Roadmap is California's policy, overarching policy, that is designed to inform and guide local education agencies in the implementation of systems to support English learners and providing opportunities for equal access and full participation in a comprehensive curriculum, which includes English language development and supports. Again, also for English learners with disabilities who also require to receive English language development in the form of designated and integrated ELD, as well as opportunities to engage in the least restrictive environment in a rich, robust, comprehensive curriculum with their non-disabled peers. And also thinking about how all of that comes into play. At the beginning of this video, before we played the video, I asked you to listen closely to the 4 guiding principles and think about how might they be recognizable at your site. To what degree do you recognize 1, 2, 3, 4 of these principles in the form of your practices, processes, approaches, strategies in support of English learners with disabilities? The California English Learner Roadmap is designed to help us move forward in refining our systems to support all English learners. So we want to be able to use it as part of our conversations when we're thinking about our systems to support English learners with disabilities, because they also fall and have the right to receive these educational services as well as described in the English Learner Roadmap. Another resource that is in support of California's commitment in honoring the diversity of our English learners in this state is this document here. This is figure 6.1, which can be found in the California Practitioner's Guide. And specifically, the specific design of this resource is to help inform educational programs for English learners with disabilities. So let's focus a little bit on the word values there. When I think about a value, I think about something that is visible, actionable, that you can see or recognize. For example, if I say that I value a healthy lifestyle, then you might be able to see me walking around the parking lot during my lunch break. Or you might be able to see more fruits and vegetables in my lunchbox. What you won't see are Doritos and a can of Coke, right? So if I truly say that I value something, then it's highly probable that you're going to be able to see it or identify what it is that I value through my actions and or through artifacts of my actions. So let's go back to this document, California Values for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. I'm going to give you a few minutes to read through this document. It's in your Padlet. If you go to the Chapter 6 column and you scroll down, I'm pretty sure they are sequenced, find Figure 6.1. I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to read through each one of these values and think about your current practices, your current approaches, your current services of your English learners with disabilities, and identify the values that you recognize are within your current practices. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And as you identify the values, please drop them in the chat to share with us what are the current values that are being attended to at your respective sites. So again, take a few minutes to read through the values, identify which of the values you clearly see within your systems, approaches, and practices addressing the needs of English learners with disabilities. So we'll give you about 3 minutes to do that. And please drop all of the values that you recognize in the chat box. So I think it's been about 3 minutes, and hopefully you've had sufficient time to dig deeply into these figures, into this figure and the values within this figure. Hopefully it helped you think about your current practices, what they look like, the instrumental elements within your system that support English learners with disabilities, that take into consideration their cultural and linguistic assets, as well as their disability and the disability-related needs. This figure is going to help us take a closer look at that and give us some guidance as to where might there be opportunities to improve, where might there be opportunities to collaborate, where might there be opportunities for training and support of practitioners, or of working with your IEP team, your multidisciplinary team, in figuring out where would be the most appropriate resources that will help us design a system to help us better understand, identify, support our English learners with disabilities as we engage and have them participate fully in a comprehensive curriculum within the least restrictive environment. This figure 610, can be found in the ELA-ELD framework. There's a question earlier today about the ELA-ELD framework and the ELD standards and how they were similar and how they were different. This particular graphic is referred to as the circles of implementation. And it's a way to capture what an educational program for English learners with disabilities could look like. So when we think about English learners with disabilities, we know that they would absolutely benefit from programs that are culturally and linguistically sustaining, that address their unique disability needs, that address accessibility to comprehensive curriculum, which includes comprehensive ELD, as well as the ELD standards. So this would be a visual representation of what those programs would look like for an English learner with disability. I want you to take note of the center circle, the blue circle, the larger blue circle in the middle. And this is where you're going to see all the discrete skills within the ELA literacy Common Core standards: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language. And at the bottom of that larger circle, you see in all disciplines. Because we engage and develop these particular skills, literacy skills, language skills, in and across all disciplines. Even though this particular graphic refers to the ELA-ELD framework, we know that students engage in reading, listening, speaking, writing, and language skills in math, science, social studies, physical education, etc. So at the core, at the very center of this graphic, we see the California ELD standards. So for English learners, which include English learners with disabilities, the California ELD standards are at the core of all curriculum because language is instrumental in teaching and learning. And for English learners who are learning English as a second language, the California ELD standards is the resource to help educators be intentional about what specific language and language acquisition skills they are focusing on to help develop language proficiency and mastery. So again, what's important here to remember is that for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, the California ELD standards play a critical role in academic success, in access, and providing equitable opportunities for them to engage in a robust curriculum that includes language development, linguistic skills, as well as the appropriate supports that are necessary. So without the California ELD standards, we are missing the mark. We're not providing what is necessary, and we're not being intentional and keeping students from receiving their educational right to receive comprehensive English language development. So how do we begin to implement comprehensive ELD? It's important for us to be familiar with the language proficiency levels and the progression of language skills. Figure 6.3 is found in the California Practitioner's Guide, but it's adapted from the ELD standards as well. And it gives us a description of the language proficiency skills as an English learner moves across as he or she is acquiring English language. So it's important for practitioners who are working with English learners with disabilities, to be familiar with language acquisition and how to use the ELD standards to help develop the sequence of language acquisition. It's important to note that an English learner with disability at any point during their trajectory of this particular sequence may display higher language proficiency skills in one particular area. Let's say perhaps the student could be at the expanding level in their speaking skills, while simultaneously being at the emerging level in their writing skills. It's important for us to note that this is not a manifestation of their unique disability. This is typical of English language development for all English learners, because we know that language does not live in a vacuum, and we're focusing on the different language skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, that it may vary, that students may have a more developed skill in one area, while a less developed skill in another area. And as they progress through language acquisition with intentional English language development, using the framework, ELA-ELD framework, and the ELD standards, then we're being intentional about our instruction, and students have a better opportunity to have more success in mastering the English language skills. So what is comprehensive ELD? Comprehensive ELD is for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, and it is comprised of two types of English language instruction. The first type of English language instruction is called integrated ELD, and the purpose of integrated ELD is designed to provide access to the content area across all disciplines, where language supports are identified and used to do exactly that, to provide access. English learners, during the integrated ELD part of their instructional day, are engaging in the content area with the appropriate language supports. The content is scaffolded and the language is differentiated based on their specific language proficiency level. This is how access to the content is provided. Designated ELD is the second type of comprehensive ELD. And designated ELD, the purpose of designated ELD is designed to provide language acquisition and mastery of the English language. During this part of the day, students are grouped by their unique or specific language proficiency level. where the listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills are further developed for the purpose of mastering the English language skills and the English language in general. So both designated and integrated ELD require the use of the ELD standards. They both are required part of daily instruction for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. So to engage in the different characteristics of comprehensive ELD at a more interactive level, in a more interactive way, we're going to, it skipped over like 3 slides, we're going to engage in a Venn diagram activity. We want to give credit to the belief modules. This particular activity comes from their module 2, and it's a way to help a practitioner really become more familiar with the different characteristics of comprehensive ELD, which includes both designated and integrated. So there's a bit.ly link that will be dropped in the chat box shortly to give you easy access to this activity. We're going to give you a little bit of time to individually on your own engage in sorting. So when you click on the link, or you can use your device to take a shot of that QR code. When you click on the link, it'll take you to a slide that looks like this. And the idea is that you organize the tiles by category, designated, integrated, and both. So we're going to give you about, I would say about 5 to 7 minutes to have you engage and place the tiles in the categories in which you feel that are most appropriate. In about 5 to 7 minutes, we'll reconvene and we'll debrief what lands where. Okay, so we'll bring you all back in about 5 to 7 minutes. And I believe the bit.ly link was already dropped in the chat for easy access. Okay, let's do a quick debrief of our comprehensive ELD sort. And we're going to start with the designated ELD section. So specifically for designated ELD, this is where the tiles will fall. And again, this activity, this exercise is just to have us have some common understanding and awareness of the different characteristics of what is similar and what is different between designated and integrated ELD. So specifically for designated ELD, what's important to know is that the language taught is connected to the content area. So our focus for designated ELD is the language of the content. So what we use are the ELD standards as the focal point to help develop that particular language in that content. In the case of designated ELD, there is a specific language objective because the focus is exactly that, language acquisition. During designated ELD, there is a specific time carved out in the day throughout the week, and it is protected time. This is part of the English learners' instructional program. English learners are grouped by proficiency level during designated ELD, during that block of time during the day. Designated ELD addresses the specific demands of that unique proficiency level that we're focusing on. So if you are working with emerging level students during designated ELD, that is the proficiency level that you're focusing on. The students in front of you are all at the emerging level, and you're using the emerging level ELD standards as a guide to develop, design, and deliver your ELD lessons on a daily basis for a protected amount of time for those students. Now let's move over to integrated ELD. So during integrated ELD, the lesson is driven by the content demand, which is necessary to provide the language supports using the ELD standards. In other words, the ELD standards serve a different purpose during integrated ELD than they did during designated ELD. During integrated ELD, the ELD standards are a way to scaffold, if you will, the content, the language of the content in which integrated ELD is occurring. So for example, if You have English learners during your history class. Usually, more often than not, history books are written in the past tense. So you're going to come across a lot of verbs and verb tenses during that part of instruction. And so you want to take into consideration the language demands of a lesson in history, which more than likely will be where verbs in the past tense will be coming up. And so we want to be aware of that as we're providing the appropriate scaffolds for the content and the appropriate supports for the language during that specific content area or discipline area. So the ELD standards serve as a support or a scaffold to provide access and language support during that particular content area. Because of that, we're focusing not only on language objectives, but content objectives as well. Integrated ELD happens all day because it happens throughout the instructional day across all disciplines, across all content areas. And if you have English learners throughout the day, then you are providing integrated ELD throughout the day for your specific content areas for those students. Because it happens throughout the day, throughout the instructional day, across content areas, integrated ELD is a type of lesson or strategy or supports that all students benefit from. English learners are required to engage in integrated ELD, meaning that they need to have the appropriate supports using the ELD standards. However, all students benefit from these supports, whether or not they're English learners. The ELD standards are used in tandem with the content standards, as I stated earlier. They are to some degree a type of support or a scaffold to help design lessons that are uniquely in support of the student's specific language proficiency need, where the content is scaffolded and the language is differentiated based on their language proficiency level. So at the middle of our Venn is what we call comprehensive ELD, and it's what both designated and integrated have in common. So both designated and integrated ELD require the use of the ELD standards to design and deliver comprehensive ELD. Comprehensive ELD supports all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. The purpose and the design of the ELD standards are to develop the English language for students whose language is primary language is other than English. Comprehensive ELD is not dependent upon a program. In other words, it doesn't happen only in a dual language program, or it doesn't happen only during this extra support class for an English learner. It is not dependent upon a program. It is dependent upon the status of the student, if he or she is an English learner, and the ELD standards. So the ELD standards drive the lesson and the instruction for comprehensive ELD, not a program. Because the ELD standards are standards, and when we use the ELD standards to design comprehensive ELD, then the content is rigorous. Devoid of the ELD standards, then we are not providing standards-based instruction, nor are we providing a rigorous curriculum for our English learners. Qualified teachers who have a CLAD, and I think most everybody nowadays graduating from their teacher ed program are a qualified teacher of English learners or multilingual learners. However, it's important to take advantage as much as possible of professional development. And if you're not fully familiar with the ELD standards, how they're designed, how they're organized, how to use them, then it's an opportunity for you to really think about what type of training do I need, what type of support do I need, because without fully knowing and understanding the purpose of the ELD standards, how to use them, the design of comprehensive ELD, when and how it happens, then we're not providing our English learners with their educational right to receive comprehensive ELD. And this again includes our English learners with disabilities. Comprehensive ELD happens across disciplines. Why? Because language doesn't live in a vacuum, right? You have to have a specific content to engage in your literacy skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. You have to be talking and reading and writing and engaging about something, about a topic, about a content. to be able to develop your the language skills that are being identified, whether it's in designated ELD or integrated ELD. And it happens on a daily basis, Monday through Friday, without fail. So think about your language arts class or your English class or your history class or your calculus class. It happens every day because students need a daily dose of content specific, standards based instruction of the particular topic in order for them to thrive and learn and meet the standards. It's not any different for English learners who need comprehensive ELD. And what we know what to teach is by use of the ELD standards. So just like we wouldn't compromise the math standards or the science standards or the calculus content standards, we wouldn't compromise the ELD standards for students who are learning English as a second language, because that's how we know and are able to gauge their progress and making sure that our lessons are designed specifically on these standards, which are research-based, and we know how language progresses and what specifically the proficiency levels look like as students are progressing and how the lessons are going to help them master the English language. So again, it's important to be familiar with the ELD standards, to be familiar with comprehensive ELD, the two types of ELD instruction, what it looks like for our English learners and our English learners with disabilities. So with that, folks, we're going to take a lunch break. We'll give you about an hour. I know we went over just a little bit, so we'll still give you about an hour. According to my watch, I have 11:40. Is that right? So let's come back at 12:40. After lunch, we'll start to wrap up Chapter 6, but we'll continue to dig into ELD and ELD supports. So with that, let's enjoy a wonderful lunch, take a break, see you in an hour. Comprehensive ELD is part of Tier 1 core instruction. It is not an intervention for English learners, nor is it an intervention for English learners with disabilities. It is part of their comprehensive curriculum, and it's a way to provide access to the content through integrated ELD and an opportunity to develop the English language through designated ELD. Again, both integrated and designated ELD are part of all English learners' core instruction. So what we want to consider as part of comprehensive ELD, specifically for our English learners with disabilities, is to take into consideration not only their linguistic skills, but also their disability-related needs and the supports that go with that. And so for that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Vanessa, who's going to walk us through the different types of supports and services that our English learners with disabilities may need when they are in the comprehensive ELD setting. Vanessa?
Thank you, Lupita. Passing the baton. Okay, everyone, hello, and nice to see all of you virtually earlier and now finally in front of the camera. So as Lupita alluded to, we're going to be looking now at elements of the least restrictive environment specific to a continuum of supports and services as we move from least restrictive to most restrictive. So as you can see, we go from general education classroom, again, that is the least restrictive, all the way down to home and hospital instruction. Considering this continuum is important as we are looking at supports and services specific to the needs of students who are multilingual language learners and also have met eligibility criteria either in one disability category or a second one, depending on what the individual need is. So again, considering when and where these supports are going to be provided, when and where these services are going to be provided is important as we consider this spectrum. Now, when we consider the least restrictive environment, we have to start looking at different models and ways of delivering opportunities for students to be able to engage to the largest extent possible with their non-disabled peers. Figure 6.11 from the California Practitioner's Guide allows us to do just that. So figure 611 has different models of co-teaching, from one teach, one observe, to a variety of other ways of establishing a co-teaching or a collaborative aspect of your teaching. Team teaching, one teach, one assess, student teaching, etc., etc. So as you look at this figure, you are able to look at a description and a short list of advantages. It might be that at this point in time in your particular school district, at your particular site, you're already engaging or exploring opportunities to have collaboration and co-teaching models put in place to support needs of students as we engage in all of these discussions that are critical, as we tend to want to include the least restrictive environment at the top of our priorities when meeting the needs of multilingual language learners and students with disabilities. Again, that dually identified lens critical as we are engaging in these conversations to determine what models are readily available, or towards what model can we start establishing steps to establish these to make them readily available. There's this sensitive button there. So there are many models out there, we know this, and a lot of them with different advantages, disadvantages, and possibilities of implementation based on available resources. So when we are looking to get an idea as to what some of these might look like in a structured English immersion setting, dual language 50-50 program, SEI special day class, figure 6.12, again from chapter 6 of the California Practitioner's Guide, gives you some ideas as to what these could possibly look like, specifically with integrated ELD and designated ELD in mind. So if we look at the very first one projected here on this slide, we're looking at a structured English immersion classroom, SEI, and looking at it through the lens of servicing students, providing supports for an English learner who's a 5th grader who has met eligibility criteria for autism. So as it's laid out here in this bulleted format, we can see that the classroom teacher is providing designated ELD and content in English with integrated ELD, keeping in mind all of the aspects and characteristics that Lupita referenced earlier as we were looking at both integrated and designated that come together and comprise comprehensive ELD. Also, we're looking at the special education teacher pushing in for co-teaching for integrated ELD science and designated ELD. Here, in this particular model, this example, the special education resource specialists, the RSP services, are initially provided in the student's primary language, with more English introduced as the student is ready, again, depending on the need for primary language. Otherwise, the teacher can provide integrated ELD instruction. An additional point of consideration in this particular structure is primary language used by teachers and bilingual aides to support students in their academic progress, in their social and emotional learning, and their sense of inclusion as they are signaled by the student's wishes. As you can see, is that there is a clear distinction between integrated ELD and designated ELD and how it's being provided. Here, with special consideration paid to the student's disability criteria and how it might manifest. Remembering that there are 13 distinct disability categories is critical as we start singling out supports, scaffolds, accommodations, tools that might be helpful in having the student engage into content, whether it be through integrated ELD with those ELD scaffolds embedded in reading, listening, speaking, and writing, or whether it be in that ELD-driven, ELD standards-driven instruction and designated ELD. Now, when we're looking at an example, again, these are examples, they are not all-encompassing. We are looking at a dual language 50-50 program. Here, we are looking at a situation that is specific to a 3rd grader who's an English learner with a Section 504 plan for ADHD. With the individual at the forefront of our consideration, of our decision-making process is important. Let's look at the first bullet through that lens. Here, the classroom teacher provides Spanish content, English content with integrated ELD, and designated ELD. The special education services are initially provided in the student's primary language with integrated ELD. In this particular situation, a bilingual aide uses primary language and integrated ELD support for classroom learning opportunities. Additionally, the classroom teacher here consults with special education teachers in weekly team meetings, including the topic of progress monitoring for designated and integrated ELD. Again, these examples here are posed not as to be all-encompassing of what should be done for students or what they should look like, rather to give us an idea and to engage in discussion. The power is always in that discussion, in that collaboration, and that engagement with your multidisciplinary team to be able to glean information from each other's areas of expertise as we seek to bring all of this together with our robust student profile to develop services and supports that are specific to the individual student need. Now the question always comes up, well, how do I determine what's available for students? How do I determine what I can start implementing for students? Earlier, when Debbie walked us through the IEP process, we touched on universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations, specifically as they relate to the LPAC. We know, of course, that the LPAC measures English language proficiency, and we're looking at 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, writing. We know that each of these domains have a list of identified universal tools available for all, designated supports available for all, and accommodations available to students with an active IEP or a 504 plan. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about right now in designing and supporting multilingual learners in designated ELD and integrated ELD? Well, the answer is that it has a lot to do with it. Let me show you how. When we look at the California Assessment Accessibility Resources Matrix, we're able to see all components of CASP, including LPAC, paper pencil, and computer-based. As you open up this resource, whether you have it electronically or have it printed out, I highly recommend that you go through it by section. We have, I believe, 5 to 6 sections, with the very first section being universal tools, followed by designated supports, followed by accommodations, specifics to the CAA or the CAW, or unlisted resources. So those are the 5, I believe, ways that the sections are laid out. If you wish to, you could tab them for easy finding if you're using the paper, the hard copy. If not electronically, you can always see your Control F and get to the section that you want to get to, or use the hyperlinks embedded. All of this to say that in order for your teams to engage in discussion and identifying supports that will allow students to engage in content area learning, given the appropriate supports, can start in becoming familiar with this resource. If we have a student who meets eligibility criteria under SLD, the IEP's been developed as it was described in Chapter 5, as Debbie covered all of those different sections from the present level, special factors. So now they have an IEP, and you are looking at what universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations to select in the statewide assessment section of your IEP development process. If you've already engaged in this discussion and you know what the disability category manifests itself as in a variety of academic contexts as it relates to listening, speaking, reading, and writing, you can now have a more informed approach in selecting how it is that you're going to be embedding supports for a student. If a student qualified under SLD has difficulty with reading, as we look at grade level standards that require reading multiple passages to then generate a composition, and we know reading is an issue, perhaps text-to-speech might be an appropriate support to be identified. As Debbie mentioned earlier, also, this should not be readily available only for assessment purposes. Rather, it should be part of our daily instruction to build fluency, to build literacy in these particular contexts. An additional point to consider is that a lot of these supports, as they're identified and embedded in your daily instruction, need to be called out by name and what their purpose is. Oftentimes, we may assume that students will know the why for a tool that was selected, but that assumption may oftentimes lead us to a situation where the student doesn't know when to use it. Because again, task and purpose wasn't necessarily pointed out by name, specifically in a variety of practice situations, so that it then becomes generalizable and applicable in a variety of contexts. A good starting point that is structured, that is helpful for teams, is using the LPAC Administration Student Accessibility Checklist. This document is available for you to access and download, whether it be on the LPAC website, on the CDE website, or embedded within our Padlet or the PDF version of our slides today. What this document does is it organizes a team's discussions, a team's important points in engaging and in reflecting on the use of accommodations, accessibility resources by domain. If you notice on the very top section of this document, you have listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It's important that the team consider supports by domain, because what might be a designated support in listening might be an accommodation in reading. It is important to also use the Accessibility Resources Matrix, D1 Matrix, as a side-by-side support to ensure that what you are selecting for the student is truly what you think it is. A good example on how this might be used is whether it be in the context of an IEPT meeting or an SSTT meeting if the student is in the process of being considered for assessment for potential eligibility for special education services. It really helps the team go step by step in considering what supports might be available for the student. An added function of this document is that it helps walk you through the decision-making process of whether a domain exemption might be appropriate or whether an alternate assessment might be appropriate. When we're looking at domain exemptions, we always want to ensure that before the team gets to this part of the conversation, we have established that we have exhausted all possible universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations. And that after discussing all of these available UDAs in each of the 4 domains, we've determined that there is no such accommodation that exists that might support the student accessing that particular domain of the LPAC. Again, important points of consideration that oftentimes aren't necessarily structured in a way where we can follow line by line, bullet by bullet, space by space. Again, a very helpful document to guide our discussion as to what accessibility resources might be appropriate for some of our students. Because again, this is going to feed into the data. When we're collecting data, we talked about data in section 1 and section 2. As special educators, as English language learner specialists, data is part of what we do day to day. This is how we make adjustments. So if we look at this structure, first we analyze data, then we analyze the intervention, then we make adjustments to interventions and refer for further assessment. Underneath each of these sections, though, we have a little bit of a snippet that allows us to see more what this looks like. So in the assessment, the pre-referral process, the assessment process, we're collecting data that is based on intentional teaching. And we're also collecting data and analyzing data that is both culturally and linguistically responsive as well as relevant. We then collect that data and analyze now intervention data, ensuring that this intervention data comes from a place of fidelity, where differentiation was established and asset building was part of the process as well. As we are making adjustments to the interventions and are referring for further assessment in this iterative process, We're reviewing the provision of core services. In this case, comprehensive ELD. Comprehensive ELD, of course, being integrated and designated ELD. Integrated across content areas, in tandem with ELD standards, and designated ELD standard specific. That is the driving standard during that period of time. This is linked with those accessibility resources we looked at before. How is this so? Well, it's because we are using these accessibility tools to engage in ongoing review of the intervention data. So for example, if we go back to the SLD situation that I talked about earlier, where reading is impacted, specifically reading comprehension. As we look at those accessibility resources and those accessibility features available for assessment, we can then start just generating opportunities for us to think, okay, so if I am going to be selecting text-to-speech as a support, how might I do this during my regular instructional time? And what role will this play in my intervention process? So you might not have the answers all at once, hence the importance of the multidisciplinary team. We can only serve and help improve outcomes if we're bringing all experts, everybody's area of expertise and experience in the building of this robust student profile. If we all come together and begin discussing how it is that we know the student, in what context, and what supports are being selected, and whether they are appropriate or not. Considering again a student who has reading comprehension deficits, perhaps having them enrolled in an intervention program that focuses on reading fluency may not be the most appropriate. It may be. Who knows? You might have data points that support that. However, it includes deep and nuanced conversations with individuals that know the student and know the content area, as well as the development of and the skills necessary in each of these particular segments. So again, progress monitoring is also inclusive of accessibility resources and supports. One of the ways that we continue to gauge our student learning, our processes, is through using formative assessment. So, formative assessment, it's been part of education forever and ever, it seems. Yet, however, myself included, we oftentimes aren't as clear as we would like to be with what it truly is. And basically, formative assessment, as pointed out by figure 6.5 in the California Practitioner's Guide, is a process. It's a process that is used during instruction that provides feedback so that we may make adjustments on ongoing teaching and learning tactics. It is not a tool or an event. It is not a test item bank or a performance task. What it is, though, it is a means of improving student learning in real time to achieve intended instructional outcomes. If the goal is to have a student access grade level text, then what supports might be available to allow a student to do so? As shared in one of our earlier slides, we believe as educators that all students can make meaningful progress if the appropriate supports are provided. And that can be done through the use of formative assessment in this trialing period, where we have clear lesson learning goals and successes that make it clear what the aim is, what the expectation is, as well as having evidence of learning during the lessons as they relate to the individual student. Where are we as a class? Where is the student as an individual? What scaffolds have I identified? What supports? What accessibility resources? As well as the pedagogical response to evidence, including descriptive feedback. What was the end goal? Where am I relative to the end goal? What might be next steps? And in allowing students to have peer and self-assessment, because we know that once we get to that point of self-assessment, we strengthen our own learning, efficacy, confidence, and autonomy. as well as engaging students in collaborative classroom culture that allows students and teachers to be partners in learning, routinely supporting one another in learning tasks. Again, these are the different ways in which formative assessment can be made and where you can embed and enlist the support of accessibility tools and resources that meet the needs that are being manifested in that intersection of disability and language proficiency. Because again, this takes us back into this iterative process where we're constantly analyzing data, analyzing interventions, analyzing supports, and making those necessary adjustments to the interventions and engaging if necessary or referring if necessary for further assessment. Because again, the California Code of Ethics for English language learners are pretty much consistent to what we would have for all other students, which include maintaining high expectations, which include maintaining a high level of professional competence, which includes promoting meaningful and inclusive participation, as well as placing collegiality and professionalism, developing relationships with families, using evidence, protecting and supporting the physical and psychological safety of our English language learners with disabilities, neither engaging nor tolerating any practice that harms our multilingual students with disabilities, as well as understanding and upholding laws, regulations, and policies that influence our practice, and finally advocating for professional conditions, learning, and resources that will help us improve the learning outcomes for all multilingual language learners with disabilities. So all of this is inclusive in our day-to-day engagement and participation as practitioners, as we work with students who are both English language learners and students with disabilities, as we consider the intersection of the two and the manifestation of in a variety of contexts and how it is that they engage with content as well. Earlier, Lupita showed us a video that talked about the 4 principles of the English Learner Roadmap. And again, English language learners with disabilities are English language learners first, just like students with disabilities are general education students first. So every single one of the principles that are highlighted in the California English Learner Roadmap are applicable to our students, English learners with disabilities. So when we're looking at Principle 1, assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools, this is inclusive of our students who are dually identified. When we're looking at the languages of our English language learners, what they bring into the classroom, when we recognize that there is no single EL profile, that we are not monolithic, when school climates affirm and validate and build and bridge, as well as having schools that value and hold strong family and school partnerships, we are being responsive to the needs of English language learners with disabilities, and their families. So this tool here is developed and available for you to help assess where it is that you stand. So this is a tool that school and district teams can use as a self-reflection rubric to engage in dialogue, to assess current status, to enact the roadmap principles, as well as to identify or assess areas that might require improvement. So again, this tool readily available for you in our resources page in our own website, but also embedded within the Padlet and included here as a live link on our slide. That was a lot. I recognize that. I want to give you some time to be able to review some of the slides that we just covered, some of the content that we just covered, and to take some time, a minute or two, to consider any new learnings, any wonderings, any questions you might possibly have related to the topics covered up until this point. We want to give you the gift of time to process some of the information, lingering questions, doubts, knowing that we're readily available to help support you in this process. As always, we want you to engage with the chat and Q&A feature within the Zoom interface so that you can share those questions with us. And we will do our best to review them and answer them as they come in so that we can best support you as practitioners in the field. I'm going to give you about I'll say 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, to go ahead and drop some questions in the chat. And as always, Lupita and Debbie are monitoring the chat right now, and they'll let me know if anything comes up that I can answer in the moment, or they will respond to you using the chat or Q&A feature. Go ahead and take 3 minutes. We'll see you back at 1:13. All right, everybody. Hopefully these couple of minutes that we gave you provided you an opportunity to process and think through all of the information we just presented. We want you to feel comfortable in sharing your learnings and wonderings, again, as mentioned, either using the Q&A feature or the chat feature. Feel free to do so as we move through our day together. So as we wrap up Chapter 6, I want to point out the different figures and appendices available within the California Practitioner's Guide and also in our website. We've taken the appendices from the Practitioner's Guide and made them available to you, the practitioner, in an easy-to-download format that are both fillable, savable, and printable. So feel free to look for these figures by clicking on the links here, or also looking for them in the Padlet. Also, as a means of reference with the Padlet, just to make clear, the one shared Padlet that we've made available today is inclusive of days 1, 2, and today, day 3. It will also be the same Padlet that will have links to material and resources for both days 4 and 5 coming up. That way you can have everything you need in one Padlet. So you'll probably need to scroll across the bottom and scroll across on the side to be able to find all of the resources. As a means of supporting organization also, we've color-coded those resources so that you know what goes with what. For example, day 1, I believe I made pink. So day 1 slides will be pink, and the columns for chapters 1 and 2 will be pink as well, because those go together, and so on and so forth. So for today, the slide deck for today should be green, inclusive of chapters 5, 6, and 7, and those 3 shelves should be green as well. So that'll help you find the resources that we're referencing today without having to go all the way across the Padlet. One of those embedded structures in the California Practitioner's Guide is the inclusion of the FAQs, frequently asked questions. So these frequently asked questions are present in every single chapter of the Practitioner's Guide. These are 2 of the frequently asked questions in Chapter 6, and you will find the answer by clicking on the link there and finding all of those questions as well. Know that these are great discussion starters as you engage with your teams, and feel free to use them accordingly as you see fit. And with that, we're going to quickly transition into Chapter 7. As you're noticing, Chapters 5, 6, and 7 are inclusive of all things related to educational programs and instructional strategies, having gone through Section 1 and Section 2 of the Practitioner's Guide. Section 1, as you can recall, involved all things of the initial identification of a student as an English learner, following the MTSS process and pre-referral interventions. Chapter 2 then walked us through pre-referral and referral, assessment, and the beginnings of the IEP process. Not necessarily writing that IEP, as you saw we did that today in Chapter 5, but it's the process that is necessary that leads up to the development of that IEP to determine whether the student meets eligibility criteria or not. Debbie then walked us through that process of establishing whether eligibility criteria was met. And then we looked at impacts of educational program, access, and equity for English language learners. Chapter 7 now goes in deeper. Now we're looking at the pedagogical aspect of it. We're looking at teaching and learning to meet the needs of English learners with disabilities. So Chapter 7 itself is specific to teaching and learning. As Lupita mentioned earlier, when we were going into Chapter 6, every single chapter begins with 2 sets of questions. Questions for practitioners, for teachers, and then for those that are administrators. Some of the questions that are present here are related to how to best meet the academic needs related to English language development, disability related, social emotional learning needs of students who are dually identified. And also, how can I use the IEP specifically the goals to inform my instructional practice. Earlier in the day, Debbie shared with us some samples of grade 3, grade 7, and grade 11 that were linguistically appropriate goals and objectives that took into consideration content standards, ELD standards, brought them together to develop a linguistically appropriate goal. So that is going to be one of the starting points, one of our lenses as we engage in Chapter 7. Chapter 7 also has a companion infographic that is linked directly into sections referenced in the chapter named here, again being 7, Teaching and Learning to Meet Student Needs. In a nutshell, Chapter 7 focuses on all teaching and learning practices for dually identified students, aiming that students have opportunities to make academic, English language, and social emotional learning progress. I want us to consider the circles of implementation again, this figure being pulled out of the framework. You can also find it here in Chapter 7 as figure 7.1, where we establish the effective contexts for learning. Go ahead and take a minute to really take in this graphic. And let's look at the center. What is at the center? At the center of it all are the ELD standards. Around it, you will find the content standards for ELA and literacy, which are inclusive of reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language in all disciplines. So when we're looking at those circles of implementation, we can also see that around it, we have language development, meaning making, effective expression, foundational skills, and content knowledge. And as Lupita mentioned earlier, none of this happens in a vacuum. It is reliant on all of its pieces to be able to create an effective context for learning. And as we're developing an effective context for learning, we need to be culturally and linguistically responsive, and also to engage in sustaining pedagogy. So when we're looking at these elements, we're looking at validating, affirming, building, and bridging. We recognize its use in daily classroom practices. We also integrate the history and culture of students into the curriculum. We also promote culturally and linguistically responsive practices as they relate to the students' healthy perceptions of their own cultural and linguistic identity, as well as supporting them in sustaining their cultural and linguistic identity, and focusing on issues of social justice for all marginalized and oppressed people. So again, keeping this framework, this work in mind is critical to fully and truly create an effective context for learning. Now, Chapter 7 referenced social emotional learning, and we know more and more that this is critical. If we refer back to Section 1, to Day 1, we talked about the MTSS process. And the MTSS framework is inclusive of academics, behavior, and social emotional. So it's recognized as an important component of a student's overall well-being. Not just academic, not just behavioral, but social emotional. So here is figure 7.3, which puts in a visual manner, again, an element of creating an effective context for learning. So guiding principles, if you will, for social emotional learning, from adopting a whole child approach, committing to equity, truly committing to equity, building capacity, partnering with families and community, and learning and improving. All of these guiding principles can help us in establishing an effective context for learning for dual language learners, for multilingual learners who are also students with a disability. One of the ways that we can do this is by using the Universal Design for Learning guidelines as a way of identifying necessary supports ways of delivering instruction, because we know UDL is not a curriculum, it's more an approach. Considering engagement, representation, action and expression, all of these structures set forth by CAST and all of their supporting documents are referenced in Figure 7.4 and in all of Chapter 7 of the California Practitioner's Guide. How is it that we make content relatable and engaging for students? How is it that we allow for them to self-regulate in their learning, sustaining attention? How is it that we support executive functioning needs to allow them to remain engaged in tasks, in lessons, in activities? That is what we're looking at when we're looking at engagement. Additionally, when we're looking at multiple means of representation, how is it that we're presenting content? How is it that we're giving information to students? And when we're looking at multiple means of action and expression, how is it that we are allowing students to demonstrate what it is that they know? I want to make another connection to this graphic with a previously covered section. We've touched on accessibility resources in both Chapter 5, 6, as well as Day 1 and Day 2. What I want you to think of now as another lens as we're seeking to make meaning is to look at those accessibility resources through this lens. When you are selecting accessibility resources for your students, you are doing so to support identified areas of need. That section in the present levels, right? That section that tells us what we're going to develop goals on, right? That section that we then use to establish our baseline, which is inclusive of where the student is in their language development journey, and the standard that is being addressed in that goal. Now, when you're looking at those accessibility resources, which of those supports, whether they be universal tools, designated supports, or accommodations, are supportive of engagement? If we have a student who has an area of need related to executive functioning, this is what we're going to look. How is it that I'm going to motivate the student, keep the student engaged, keep the student focused? How do we support self-regulation? If I think off the top of my head, breaks, masking. Some of those supports are going to allow students that are English language learners with a disability, students with a disability, anybody, because we know that those accessibility resources have two categories that are available for all students. In the case of dually identified students, since they have an active IEP, they can also access accommodations. Now, when looking at representation, how information is presented, which of those accessibility resources might be supportive in how information is presented to the student? In the classroom, you, the teacher, you're the one presenting information, so you get to determine how you do that. PowerPoint, lecture, video, combination of those three, combination of more, whichever way you have of presenting information. Considering assessment practices, though, are we streamlining the screen? Are we having text, then questions appear? How is it that we're presenting this information? Are we enabling text-to-speech to present what would typically be written down in an auditory format to be supportive of a student's individual need? When we're considering action and expression, what supports identified as an accessibility resource that are quote unquote turned on for assessment can be used in the classroom? How is it that students are going to show what they know? Are they going to be allowed to share orally, write it down, speech to text, tell a partner, make a pamphlet, make a video? All of these things resonate as we're developing teaching and learning practices for students who are dually identified. So again, I invite you to look at those accessibility resources with this lens, because they truly are supportive of identification of appropriate supports for identified areas of need as determined by the present levels that help us establish a baseline for where it is that our students are. And again, as mentioned earlier, the MTSS supports for English language learners covers all three: academic, behavioral, social, emotional. And as you can recall, if you were with us on day one, Tier 1 encompasses universal core instruction, of which comprehensive ELD is a part of. So just a little reminder there. And then second, when we're looking at Tier 2 instruction, here we're looking at short-term supplemental instruction that is strategic and targeted, right? With clearly identified goals. So the purpose of Tier 2 instruction is to amplify learning in a diagnosed area, in a clearly identified area. That is now identified. Why? Because Tier 1 core instruction did not meet that need, right? So when you're trying to put a number to it, we're talking about 10 to 15% of students that might need this level of intervention. Because again, the thing is that in Tier 1, most all students, around 80% of students, should be able to learn successfully. When we're looking at Tier 3, just as a review from day one, here we're looking at intensified intervention support that is longer in duration. Knowing, of course, that this is an iterative process, right? Just because you're in Tier 3 doesn't mean you can't go back to Tier 2. Just because you're in Tier 2 doesn't mean you can't go back to Tier 1. What is important to remember is that you retain Tier 1 throughout. Tier 2 and Tier 3 are on top of. So comprehensive ELD being part of Tier 1 means that it shouldn't be occurring only in Tier 3 or only in Tier 2. So few students, around 5%, maybe less, will need Tier 3 intensified supports. So what does this mean for you as teams, as members of teams, is that this is a process that might require some deeper looking into, some conversation, some reflection, where perhaps you end up deciding, you know what, based on what we have in place, this is exactly what we need to have. This is perfect. We're doing it all that we need, all in the way that needs to be done. This is great. Or it might be that certain areas need fine-tuning. Or it might be that certain areas are in an implementation place where perhaps you're looking at expanding. So again, more than anything, and as always, the importance is the conversation, the time, the engagement with a multidisciplinary team that brings together different viewpoints as we really tackle these areas of support that are in place for students, for our English learners, knowing that even if a student has an active IEP, they should still have access to Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 as needed. What is consistent is Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 as needed. And just a brief reminder, Tier 3 is not special education. Okay, so Tier 3 is not special education. Tier 3 is reserved for that give and take 5% of students that weren't able to access universal core instruction in Tier 1, which includes comprehensive ELD, once more, who weren't able to make progress with Tier 2 interventions and who weren't able to make progress with Tier 3 interventions, went through the process, and eligibility criteria was met, then perfect. They get on top of the MTSS framework, on top of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, they get special education supports and services, always retaining Tier 1. That was a lot. Once more, as we gather our thoughts, make sense of what was shared, I'm going to pose a question. And the question is, do English learners with disabilities need to have designated ELD? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. Yes, no, I don't know, I'm not sure, or like everything in special education, it depends. Which is it? Do English learners with disabilities need to have designated ELD? Survey says yes. Hopefully, I said it a lot. Yes, all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, receive both integrated and designated ELD, which together comprise a comprehensive approach to ELD. So again, comprehensive ELD is inclusive of both, and all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, retain both as part of their Tier 1 core instruction. Every day, every day. And with that, we are going to take a 10-minute break. Take a 10-minute break to stretch, to give your brain a little bit of a kickback, a little bit of a time to just settle down, and we will be back at 1:45. 1:45. We'll see you then.
We're turning the corner in our presentation today. And before we move into the next slide, I want to come back to this response from one of the FAQs from Chapter 7. And so in response to the question, do English learners with disabilities need to receive comprehensive ELD, designated ELD specifically? And the answer is indeed yes, because designated ELD, again, is part of comprehensive ELD instruction in which all English learners are entitled to. So in order to be able to provide effective comprehensive ELD instruction, we need to be familiar with the ELD standards. So we're going to spend a little bit of time becoming familiar with the ELD standards. More of a bird's eye view is what I like to call it. This graphic represents both the organization and the key features of the ELD standards. And as you can see here, it is organized into 3 parts. So we're going to walk through each of the parts, because each of the parts contains a set of standards, a purpose, and a goal. So let's start with part 1. Part 1 of the ELD standards are designed to help teachers design lessons that have English learners interact in meaningful ways with their peers, with their teachers, using varied text for the purpose, the goal of developing their skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, their receptive skills and their expressive skills. And they do this through what is referred to as the modes of communication that you can see here in the 3 bubbles of part 1. The collaborative mode, which it really is about working together, working collaboratively, using those listening and speaking skills. The productive mode, being able to produce a product, whether it's in writing or in spoken language, again, with the support of peers, the teacher, and a resource text. And then the interpretive mode, which really enhances and develops the receptive skills, both through reading and listening. So through these 3 modes of communication and the standards that are contained in the part 1 of the ELD standards, students are able to have opportunities to apply the language that they are learning, which takes us to part 2. Part 2 of the ELD standards are a set of standards designed for teachers to create lessons that help students, English learners, learn about how the English language works. And the way that that is done is by having students interact with varied text. And in that varied text, they're taking a look at language, the sentences, the phrases, and analyzing that language to be able to develop vocabulary skills, language skills, through meaning making. So students are able to learn how the English language works in the context of the text, of the very text that they are reading. And through that text, building comprehension, building concept development of the words and word phrases that they are learning explicitly through the standards in part 2. So let's shift our focus to part 3 at the bottom of this graphic. So part 3 are the foundational literacy skills. Now the foundational literacy skills are exactly that. They are the foundational literacy skills found in the Common Core standards for kinder through 5th grade. However, when we use them as part of the ELD standards for English learners, the purpose is to have students use the foundational literacy skills more specifically with an emphasis on oral and written language, and use their primary language whenever possible to build that bridge. This is where we really take into consideration the students' language resources as an asset, because we recognize and acknowledge that students come to the table with skills, language skills, with understanding of content, with understanding of how to engage in language for different purposes and using language for different purposes in a different context. So part 3 ELD standards helps the teacher of an English learner look at those discrete foundational skills, acknowledging what the student may already know about the English language, making connections with, whenever possible, to the primary language, and then building that bridge in order to further develop the foundational literacy skills. So let's draw our attention up back to the cluster, those bubbles, parts 1 and 2, and please take note of that arrow in between those clusters. So this arrow is there to remind us that although in this graphic we see 2 separate clusters of standards, if you will, they're not exclusive of each other. By design, the ELD standards are designed to work in tandem together with each other. So as teachers of English learners, we are to determine a few things before we start crafting, drafting, and implementing our ELD lessons. One of those things is to determine, am I using the ELD standards to develop and deliver a designated ELD where the standards are my focus and language development and acquisition is my goal? Or am I using the ELD standards for integrated ELD, where I'm deliberately using the standards as a way to scaffold the language of the content in which my English learner is engaging in, whether it's math, science, social studies, etc. So again, the ELD standards, although in this graphic are separate, by design, they are really supposed to be used together in tandem. So think about it this way. Depending on your lesson, your goal, and your purpose, we're using elements or standards from part 1, teaching kids how the English language works, how language is put together, and how the way that it's put together, it builds meaning. So this is how it works, right? This is what we're learning about the English language. And then using the part 1 ELD standards to have students engage in using that new learned language in an authentic and meaningful ways. So part 2 is what we're learning about English, and part 1 is how we're practicing using this new language in a meaningful way. So I hope that makes sense in terms of how to use the ELD standards and how they are organized by design. So one final thing regarding this graphic, down towards the bottom of the graphic, you'll notice the 3 language proficiency levels: emerging, expanding, and bridging. But more importantly, I want you to take note of those arrows in between and at the beginning and at the end, if you will, of that sequence: emerging, expanding, and bridging. So these arrows represent the progress and the process in which the language levels are developed. And again, because language doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we can't package it in a little box and just make sure that everything happens in that box and then move and shift that box over. That's not how language works or is developed, nor is it how children learn. It's important for us to recognize that students are bringing in varied language resources. And those language resources include their primary language and the development of that primary language as it impacts the learning of the second language. So that's what those arrows represent. So at the beginning, if you will, of this process where we see that arrow right before the emerging level, this indicates that we are taking into consideration and acknowledging the varied language resources that the English learner is bringing. And if that means that we need to identify to what degree does the student already know English and what skills are they and to what level, as well as how fluent is he or she or literate is he or she in his or her primary language, because that also plays an instrumental role, not only in language development, but in learning. So in a nutshell, what I call the bird's eye view, this is kind of an overview of the organization and the key features of the ELD standards. So in order for us to be able to implement successfully comprehensive ELD for all of our English learners, particularly our English learners with disabilities, a critical feature is to know and understand how to use the ELD standards in designing and delivering ELD instruction. Because we know, we've said this a couple of times, we know that comprehensive ELD is part of Tier 1 instruction. It is part of core instruction for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. And comprehensive ELD involves two types of ELD instruction, not either or, but both, integrated and designated. So in order to start thinking about how to design our comprehensive ELD lessons, we have this, what I think is a really good resource. It's an excellent resource to help us start thinking about what are some of the key features that we want to remember and include as we're designing, as we're planning our ELD lessons. So figure 7.1 is a set of strategies. These are strategies specifically designed to help us plan ELD lessons for English learners with disabilities. And that's what the glasses icon represents, right? We're taking into consideration both the English language proficiency of the student as well as their disability category and the needs that we have to consider to support that. So figure 7.9, and here we see just a few of the questions to help us guide that thinking and planning of ELD lessons, ELD instruction for English learners with disabilities. So this is just the planning part of it. So I've underlined some of the key things that are really important to remember. And again, just taking that dual lens into consideration. First and foremost, we need to be familiar and understand the student's language proficiency level. Not only what level, but what does that mean? What does emerging level mean for this particular lesson? What is the student able to do at that level, and what might that look like? What might that look like for their reading skills as compared to their listening skills, as compared to their speaking skills? So really becoming familiar not only with the proficiency level, but what it means in the context of the task at hand. Another consideration is absolutely understanding what clusters of ELD standards are necessary to be able to provide access and be able to make sure that the language that is being focused on is being developed intentionally and standards-based. So that means that we need to know what clusters of the ELD standards are necessary to help us focus on developing those lessons so that we can be intentional about English language development. Another consideration are really taking a look at the task and the lesson at hand and thinking about what are some of the possible challenges that this lesson or this task may present for this particular student. And so this is where we look at language through the lens of what students know or don't know and start providing those appropriate supports. Another important consideration is once we teach those forms of English, we absolutely want to be able to know how the student is going to interact in that new learned language and in meaningful ways, in authentic ways with their peers, so that students are getting a really instrumental opportunity to learn and develop English and master those particular skills. And finally, a very important feature for English learners with disabilities is to understand what types of accommodations, modifications, and scaffolding is necessary as it relates to their particular disability category. So again, figure 7.9 is a wonderful resource to help us start thinking about those key features when we design ELD lessons for ELs with disabilities. So after you plan your lesson, you're thinking about all of these critical elements. You want to start also shifting your focus to, now that I have my lesson, what's that going to look like in terms of delivery? So here we have figure 710, which is an excellent resource from the Practitioner's Guide, again, focusing on teaching and learning strategies for English learners with disabilities. Here you see a snapshot of one of the 6 categories identified in this particular resource. This one focuses on leveraging background knowledge. When you're deciding on which strategies you want to use to help deliver your lessons, to provide access and meaningful participation of all of your English learners, it's important to think about who is sitting in front of you and also what strategies are going to really maximize the students' linguistic assets. So this particular one, as you can see here by the underlines, we're focusing mostly on background knowledge as well as primary language. So when we're focusing on strategies that really build on and maximize the students' assets and their linguistic assets rather, then we are, it's half the battle, guys. It's really giving students the opportunity to very quickly engage, participate, and express their understanding of the lesson, the content, the task, because they're using resources, skills, content that they already know, that they're familiar with. So it's not a blank slate to begin with, right? So providing opportunities for them to use or for you to provide tools to engage with their primary language so that they can access the content of the task, and or building upon what you already know as part of their background knowledge is going to be a high leverage strategy to help students engage in your ELD lessons. And so on that topic of primary language support, we want to reiterate that primary language support is not primary language instruction. Apples and oranges to some degree. When we speak about primary language support, we're talking about a high leverage strategy to be able to have students engage in, participate, and express their understanding of what we are teaching. So again, primary language support can be a person, right? You can be the resource if you are able to engage in the student's primary language. Here in Imperial County, most of our English learners' primary language is Spanish, and many of us as educators, homegrown educators, we have that ability to be able to connect and provide primary language support because we're familiar with the primary language. But I know just driving over the hill to San Diego, automatically we're moving into another area where Spanish may not be predominantly the primary language of the students there. I recognized that not too long ago. I was informed that I think there's a very large Chaldean population, Hmong. So it's changing. Again, English learners, very diverse, very different student population. And so we want to take those things into consideration. But back to primary language support. When you, as the teacher, instructor, case manager, are not the primary language support resource, then there are other resources, right? The students themselves can be each other's resource. When you think about, one of the things that I really appreciate about collaborative interaction among students is that they are each other's the best scaffold, right? They can lean on each other, they can support each other, they literally are seeing each other eye to eye, and they help build each other up if we as teachers design our context for learning that way. So again, a primary language support and resource doesn't have to be a person. It could be the children themselves, their peer-to-peer. It could be a resource like a thesaurus or a dictionary, or technology. You know, Vanessa just walked us through an array of resources for technology that I know you probably don't remember them all, but thank goodness we have that Padlet for you because they're easily accessible to you there. So again, primary language support, high leverage resource. In this slide, we have just a few recommendations that perhaps you're familiar with. But again, just to call them out and be very explicit about what we're referring to when we talk about primary language support, things as simple as explaining instructions in the student's primary language. And that could be a word or two or a phrase or two. It does not literally mean writing out the whole set of instructions verbatim. Written translation, the same thing. Attention to cognates, especially if the primary language is very similar to English, like Spanish, where a lot of cognates can be found and students can easily relate to what the word is. They could read it, they could write it, but more importantly, they understand what it means. And then another very important high leverage approach is to invite, encourage, and support students to use their primary language as a way to flesh ideas out, write out what they're thinking, or even engage in a task in their primary language. Why? Because this is a way for them to, number one, engage in the lesson, continue to develop their literacy skills, because a literacy skill in any language is a way to develop thinking, is a way to develop communication. And now our job is to help bridge that, right? So the more opportunities we offer students to engage in primary language, then we're acknowledging that they truly have something to share, that we acknowledge that their language resources are an asset and they contribute to their learning and their education. So, having said all of that, I invite you, I encourage you, I challenge you to stand firm in this belief that English learners with disabilities, like all students, are able and capable to attain high-level content standards through comprehensive ELD across the content area, right, with the necessary specialized supports. So please, take into consideration your current practices, your current policies, your current approaches, your mindsets perhaps, and think about what are some of the things that we learned today, that you listened to, that you saw in the chat, that you read, that you explored in the slide deck, that you found in the Padlet, that made you think about, I'd like to try that. I think this might make a difference. I think this would help fill in the blank, because I'm pretty sure every teacher thinks about at least one child when we're talking about a specific tool or a specific scenario, like, oh yeah, that would have worked for Pedro. So I'm pretty sure you thought of at least one child that some of our resources or some of the things that we talked about would have helped or impacted in a positive way. So folks, on that note, I do want to give you one final opportunity to engage with Vanessa as she walks us through some final considerations for additional supports for students, English learners with disabilities. So I'm going to hand it back to my friend.
Thank you. I'm back. So as Lupita mentioned so expertly, it's about taking all of these things into consideration, right? Specifically in the context of Chapter 7, when we're talking about all things teaching and learning. So right now, going back to integrated and designated ELD, emphasizing disability-related services, we're going to look at the following. So Lupita made reference to assistive technology, and so did Debbie earlier on in the day. And when establishing these IEP goals and then monitoring student progress over time, the IEP team must consider the individual student's needs, including the following: assistive technology, low incidence disability, specialized services or equipment, considerations for students who are visually impaired, or for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, and if the student's behavior impedes learning, and how this will be addressed. So again, we're thinking of all those things for those of you that are SACE users, all of these areas that are covered in the special factors page, right? Is there a need for assistive technology? Is there a low incidence disability? So on and so forth. So in considering where the student is at this period of time, knowing that an IEP is developed on a yearly basis, reviewed, and then determinations are made based on identified areas of need as related by data points that are then incorporated and developed into the present levels of performance. And then this in turn takes us to that baseline, right? So as we're closing that gap, as we're aiming to close that gap, what might additional resources identified that could be implemented? When we're looking at the gamut of assistive technology available from no tech to low tech to high tech, does it really match up with a student's area of need? Does it really match up with their language proficiency? And if they have specific needs related to a visual impairment, being deaf or hard of hearing, again, what might those supports look like in delivering integrated and designated ELD? When we think about the 4 domains inclusive of English language development, there are 4 specific ones: listening, speaking, reading, writing, expressive language, receptive language, right? An oral language composite, a written language composite. Considering the impact of the disability, coupled with language acquisition, language proficiency, where they are in this process, is going to make a difference in the determination of the appropriate supports. If the disability is manifested more in the area of writing, what might some of these supports necessary to appropriately access integrated and designated ELD, what might those accessibility processes developed and provided through AT, what might those be? If there is a situation where writing might be limited because of any type of injury, disability, any limitation that would provide a student a situation where writing with a paper and pencil, where that might be difficult, how is it that we're considering supports that might allow the student to show what it is that they know as they're developing language? Again, critical aspects to keep in mind as we're developing our IEPs, as we're building our instruction, as students are engaged in learning tasks, and what it is that it's going to look like as we come through. So earlier, Lupita shared with you framing questions with English learners with disabilities. And again, this is the planning aspect of your lesson, right? What is the language proficiency of your students, the clusters, oral language, all of these pre-instructional considerations. This is your planning mode. When you are looking through it through a disability manifestation lens, that is going to help you establish the supports that are necessary. So for example, given a situation where a student might have difficulty in producing an oral presentation, what supports might be embedded from the get-go in the UDL spirit that might be available for that one student, but also for perhaps other groups of students that might prefer that modality as well. When you are selecting scaffolding or accommodations, are they truly supportive of engagement? Are they allowing the student to connect to that task? So for example, a student who is an English language learner and the student struggles with writing, right? So it makes sense that if they struggle with the writing, paper, pencil task of writing, then I will enable speech to text. I need to know more about my student though. If this student is an English learner, but they are a newcomer, a recent arrival, with limited schooling in both English language and their primary language, might speech to text truly be an appropriate accommodation? It might not. But this should be part of these framing questions. If the student is a new arrival with limited schooling or interrupted schooling, and you are wanting them to produce a written piece. However, where they are at their language acquisition stage is at that very, very, very beginning stage. Possibly some of the English phonemes aren't fully developed. And as they're trying to use that feature, it becomes more of a hindrance than a support for that particular student. They know exactly what it is that they want to say, yet what is being picked up by the technology isn't necessarily mirroring what it is that they're trying to say. And that takes us back to the primary language support, or perhaps there is a peer or a teacher or a support a staff there present that is learned or at least exposed to the student's primary language to be able to make sense. And perhaps that might be more appropriate than a speech to text. Again, for a student who is perhaps at that expanding range and might need writing support, perhaps their speech to text might be appropriate. But again, case by case, considering the disability, considering the manifestation of, considering language acquisition, and all those little nuanced bits like phonemic awareness, like phonics, just the production, the language production, all of these bits and pieces that at the end make up who the student is and that help us make determinations as the appropriateness to supports for English learners. And then going back again to figure 7.10, which is all about teaching and learning strategies for ELs with disabilities. Here is the delivery of, right? So we know that with all of our students, the importance of leveraging background knowledge. With students with disabilities, it becomes incredibly more so to be able to connect, hook, and retain interest, and to then allow them to engage with the content that is being presented in a way that is meaningful to them. And when we're talking about English learners with disabilities, leveraging background knowledge that encompasses their cultural background, their primary language, and all of these different aspects of it, of who it is that they are, of their home culture, is important in leveraging all of these strategies and bringing them together in a way that is meaningful and supportive of students who are English learners with disabilities. Visual aids, as always, short videos, incredibly supportive media in any sense is also appropriate. When we consider back when we were looking at figure 7.9 and we were talking about the planning and assistive technology, this also has a role here as we're selecting visual aids and short videos, knowing full and well that a lot of these accommodations, a lot of these supports should not only be pulled down and made available during assessment periods, but rather provide opportunities throughout the day, throughout the school year, Monday through Friday, in all content areas, so that the student delivers their access, delivers their knowledge, their mastery in a way that is more consistent with everyday tasks, and isn't reserved solely for opportunities where they are being assessed. So just making sure that the visual aids and supports provided are appropriate for the student is going to be critical, including the use of captioning to help students develop knowledge, because it is important to note that when students come to us, whether their primary language is Spanish, Chaldean, any other language, they're already bringing something in, right? They are bringing assets, cultural, language, home culture, whatever it is that they have experienced in life is an asset. And we need to spend time discovering what that is and building upon that so that we can then establish a situation where the student feels valued and we are using these assets that they bring to build upon. In making determinations as far as to what types of accommodations for English learners with disabilities are available, figure 711 from the California's Practitioner's Guide gives you a nice table that gives you a comparison of a traditional classroom and a UDL classroom. Again, here it's all coming together, right? Earlier we talked about the UDL framework, we talked about accommodations. Now we're bringing it together to show you that through line. We're looking at changes in Timing or scheduling. A UDL classroom would have these embedded from the get-go. Again, by design, not retrofitted. When we're looking at changes in setting or environment, here's what the UDL classroom would look like. And again, as always, these are meant to be examples, not exhaustive lists and tables of what you could do. You might have some strategies that you implement on your day-to-day that are incredibly helpful for students. And we invite you to share those in the chat. It's always important for us to connect and to help each other grow. So if you have any other practices as far as accommodations for English learners with disabilities, go ahead and drop those in the chat to share out with your peers. And again, it's important for me to reiterate the fact that accommodations do not reduce the learning or performance expectations. Like, I want to make that very clear. Rather, they allow students to complete an assignment or an assessment with a change in presentation, response, setting, timing, or scheduling. Why? So that learners are provided equitable access during instruction and assessment. It's important that we do away with this myth of, well, that's unfair to others. If I need a specific accommodation or support to be able to demonstrate what I know, I need that. It's not a nice thing to do for me. I require that. If I were to be judged by my ability to read something without my glasses when I'm reading up close, I'm rendered illiterate. I need that support. So considering our own supports in our day-to-day, our own accommodations in our day-to-day, help us get a sense of what's necessary for our students. We are simply changing presentation, response, setting, timing, and scheduling, all in the name of equity. Equitable access during instruction and assessment. Let's pull it all together now. We've had a day full of all things IEP, programming, teaching, and learning. We invite you to meet Mateo. Mateo is an English learner who meets eligibility criteria under specific learning disability in middle school. Something for everybody. We usually focus on elementary. Here's a middle school student. We read about Cruz earlier, elementary. Now let's look at a situation with a student in middle school. So here we're pulling all of the resources that we explored in Chapter 5, Chapter 6, and Chapter 7. If you have access to the PDF slides to this document, clicking on the image of the document will take you to the PDF file. If not, please check the chat box, and there should be a link dropped in there that will take you directly to the resource that I'm going to be referencing. Go ahead and take a second to click it open, but give me a minute so I can explain to you what we're going to be doing. So this is a lengthy document. I want to put that up front. However, what it does is it truly does pull it all together. So when we looked at the Cruz scenario, all of you mentioned how it was an idealized scenario. It was what we would all like to see when we finally get to that point where we're developing an IEP. And it's a scenario for that particular reason. And it also involves us making some assumptions that certain things took place. So as we've kept mentioning throughout our time together, what's important here is the reflection and the discussion. So as you read Mateo's student scenario, we're going to be looking at the supports that are provided to him with the lens of the resources that we shared with you, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Take some time to read it through. After you read it through, reference the table that is included in the last 2 pages of the student scenario and click open some of those links. Using the title as your North Star, so to speak, pop open resources that you think might be helpful in Mateo's situation, or perhaps you're thinking of your own school site. Perhaps you're thinking of your role, your specific relative role in an IEP setting, in a multidisciplinary team setting, where you might reference this document. Feel free to read through them and select a resource or two that would be supportive of your practice or the practices outlined in the student scenario. Because this is a lengthy document, we will give you 10 minutes and then we will check with time to see if you need additional time. But we really want to give you the gift of time right now to sit and read through it carefully. If as you're reading, questions pop up, once again, drop them in the chat or in the Q&A feature so that we may engage with you in attempting to answer as many questions as we can. For the time being, we are at 2:25. I want to give you until 2:35, and then we'll check in to see if additional time is needed. Go ahead and take that time starting now.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Thank you immensely to Vanessa and Lupita as they review Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the California Practitioner's Guide. We hope that this particular scenario regarding Mateo assisted you with further looking at it from the lens of that multidisciplinary team approach, as you again have reflected throughout the day about the responsibilities of both special educators and general educators as we collectively work together to support, encourage, and improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Putting it all together, I think, truly emulates this particular activity as you have access to an amount of resources that you were not able to review all today. So given that this task is so inclusive and encompassing of the varied needs of students, and in this particular scenario, a student, as we consider the individual needs of every student that we meet, this particular scenario may assist you with your teams as you decide what are the next steps after today's session. We reviewed the IEP, designated and integrated ELD, the use of the ELD standards, development of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, and now instructional strategies and pedagogy with the use of primary language resources and assistive technology. There's many different entry points where you may think and consider of where your team will go next. In this work towards improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities, you may consider, where is our entry point? Do we want to actively engage in everything? One thing, a few things that you gleaned and gathered from today's session. This particular task of reviewing the scenario of Mateo, we hope may be a reflective opportunity for you to engage with your multidisciplinary teams, as this could be future work, as your teams come together around a scenario and looking at what are instructional practices as they appear right now, and what could be next steps to deepening and strengthening designated ELD for English learners with disabilities in the least restrictive environment. As we engage in this work, we hope that you will join us in this collective commitment. You may have participated as an individual today or with other team members from your district participating, whether together or independently. But together we know that we have a shared responsibility to ensure that we are responsive, that we see our schools as assets-oriented, needs-responsive. And what does that look like? That we engage in meaningful ways with parents, families, and guardians, that our schools and districts are supportive of the professionals as they deepen their knowledge towards development of educational equity, culturally and linguistically appropriate practices for students that provide high quality teaching and learning experiences for all students. So as we engage in this work, We always are appreciative of any new learnings, wonderings, and those things that resonated with you. We love to also have the sharing of resources. So if you have additional resources that you'd like to share with today's participants, please drop them in the chat. Sharing really is caring as we extend again across the aisle, across the door, across the parking lot, EL specialists, general educators, and special educators together, leveraging our experiences, our expertise in support of students whom are English learners and English learners with disabilities. Chapter 7 had, again, a vast array of figures and appendices. We have them listed here. Again, if there were a few that you wanted to go back to, do know that on our website, you have all the figures and resources there, as well as all the appendices that are downloadable and fillable to support your practice. As with every chapter, the frequently asked questions are also available to you, as there may be references, demystifications perhaps that need to occur within your respective teams, school district sites, COEs, LEAs, and SELPAs. As we engage in this work, again, we are always learning and growing and honing our own practice here at Imperial County and in support of you statewide as we again work together. We do have a survey that we will send to you in an email after today's session, along with the Padlet. Again, and as long as you are continuing to connect with us, we will also send you the recording once it is posted live on our website. So do look out for that email from the OMS as you received other emails from us as well. Your feedback is truly important and necessary to us, as again, the survey helps us refine our own practice to ensure that we're providing you with the most up-to-date resources that you need in your respective communities. If you wish to reach out to us via email, this particular email, improving-outcomes_EL_SWD@icoe.org, does come directly to all three of us, including our assistant. So Lupita, Vanessa, and myself, we will respond to any emails that come into that inbox, as well as our personal email, which you have as well. We hope that you will follow and tweet us at EL_SWD. If there was something that you particularly liked, a highlighted resource, please tweet, share, and again, we want to connect with everyone statewide and extend our reach. For that reason, we also want to share that along with our website, our recorded modules and sessions as these that we broadcast statewide, we are available to engage with your respective LEA, COE, and SELPA, and our region in totality as you focus on tailor-made sessions that meet your region's needs. If you have an interest in any of the particular topics that you heard today, or any of the specific topics elevated in the chapters of the California Practitioner's Guide, we'd be happy to connect with you and create sessions that meet the needs of your region and the entry point where you see again a deepening of a need and want to explore that particular area, topic, and or resource. So please do reach out to us via email, access our website, and we can work with you independently of these statewide sessions. We also have an interactive map on our website that shows and demonstrates, again, those particular regions where you may be able to connect with your respective SELPA director who may have already gone through some of our sessions or where we've had a series of sessions in that COE, SELPA, or LEA. Absolutely, and lastly, we want to say thank you. Our greatest thanks and appreciation for your passion and commitment to improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. You have stayed with us through the duration of this session, and again, we hope have been engaged, enlightened, and maybe assured that you are engaging in best practices already for English learners with disabilities. Again, we welcome all the feedback and the emails, questions, and wonderings. We will continue to stay online for another 15 minutes to address any questions that are left in the chat box and or the Q&A. So again, we thank you for your commitment to students across California and in your region specifically as we collectively work to improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Thank you again to Imperial County, our CDE and CCEE partners who again fund our SELPA Content Lead project, improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.